Oh, before I forget, man, I was wondering if you could help me with something. The cashier, an acne-riddled kid who looked to be in his late teens or early 20s, looked up from shoving the bag of potato chips, 2 sodas, and a pack of Lucky Strikes into a plastic bag. For a moment, he just stood there, seemingly frozen in mid-action. Then he finally answered. "Yeah, what's up, man?" I let out a barely perceptible sigh. I'd been half afraid that I would be told to take a long walk off a short pier, to put it politely. Feeling relieved, I reached into my back pocket for what was there. You see, I seem to have, sort of gotten lost out here. I decided to take a late-night drive and ended up getting turned around on all these 2-lane back roads. I unfolded the map and set it on the counter so he and I could both see it before continuing. "So, I was hoping you could point out on here roughly where we are, and, more importantly, the way to get back to the main road." There was another long stretch of silence, and then the kid began to laugh, softly at first, and then louder. "Dude, a paper map?" he managed out between wheezes. "Are you for real? What year do you think this is? 1993. For my part, I simply let out a resigned sigh. I'd had a bad feeling I would be getting this sort of reaction from someone his age, and it looked like I'd been proven correct. Can't say I didn't see it coming. He wiped tears from the corners of his eyes and looked at me. "Seriously, bro, don't you have GPS in your car or something?" he asked. Immediately, I hooked a thumb over my shoulder, pointing out the glass entry door at the beige sedan sitting at the gas pumps. "Not in a Honda Accord from 1979, I replied simply. As he looked behind me out the door, I could see he wanted to make another quip, probably something about how I should buy a newer car or something. Thankfully, though, he kept it to himself. Instead, he leaned over the map and, still chuckling softly to himself, began looking at it. A few moments later, he snapped his fingers. "Ha! I still got it," he said proudly. Then pushed his finger down near the middle of the map and looked up at me. "We're right about here, roughly 6 or 7 miles outside Placer." I leaned over the counter to see as he drew his finger away. "Here?" He nodded, and I pulled a pen out of my pocket, circling the area as a reminder once I left, then examined the map further. "Okay, so it seems I could take more than a few roads to get back to Interstate 5, right?" The kid nodded again, clearly already bored with the unusual interaction by the slightly annoyed look which had begun to cross his face. "Sure," he said simply, then placed my bagged items on top of the map. "That'll be 14.50 cents for this, and 28.50 for the gas." I reached into my pocket and pulled my wallet out, withdrawing 3 20s and handing them to him. The register let out its trademark ding as it shot open, and he placed the bills in it before pulling out and handing me my change. Placing it and my wallet back into my pocket, I picked up the bag and folded the map back up. "Thanks for the help," I said as I turned to head out the door. "Yeah, no problem," I heard him mutter at me as I crossed to the front door and pushed it open. A small bell hung from the inside handle jangled as I stepped outside and let the door swing shut behind me. The sounds of the refrigerators humming and the fluorescent lights softly buzzing was replaced by those of a summertime forest at night. Crickets and cicadas buzzed loudly in the grass around the store, almost overwhelming the buzzing sound of the lights over the pumps. The sound of an owl hooting loudly echoed through the trees, followed by the loud call of what had to be an elk. I inhaled the clean air before heading down the steps for my car. Pulling open the driver's door, I took one last look around before dropping into the driver's seat. "So, did you find out where we are?" asked a voice from the passenger seat. For a split second, a wave of confusion and panic swept over me, and I spun in my seat. It was immediately replaced by a wave of embarrassment, amplified as my friend began to let out a deep laugh. "Dude, were you in there that long that you forgot I was out here waiting for you?" Not wanting to admit I had done just that, I shook my head. "Nah, bro, not that. Just dealing with the kid in there was a major headache." He nodded sympathetically. Craig was one of my close friends. Ever since we'd met each other, we'd immediately clicked and had stuck with each other from that point on. And one thing we both loved to do was take late-night drives to nowhere, simply driving around with no destination in mind, listening to the radio and occasionally sharing a joint one of us would buy. This is the first time we've ever gotten lost, though. I reached into the bag, pulling out the bottle of Mr. Pibb and handing it to him. "Here," I said simply, before pulling the Lucky Strikes out and chucking the rest into the back seat. Pulling the key from my pocket, I slid it into the ignition and turned it, the car's buzzer sounding as the dash lights came on. A moment later, the inline 4 quietly rumbled to life with its traditional burble. Tearing open the packaging, I pulled a cigarette from the pack and stuck it into the corner of my mouth before reaching to push in the car's cigarette lighter. As I did, I shot a glance back towards the store and froze. A small shiver shot down my spine as I realized the kid was standing at the door and staring out at us. What the actual hell? Craig caught my gaze and turned to look himself. "Dude, what the hell is his problem?" I shook my head as the lighter popped back out, signaling it was ready to use. I pushed the glowing red coil against the tip of the smoke for a moment until it was lit, then placed it back in its slot. I pulled it from my lips and exhaled a cloud of smoke before answering, feeling more than a bit unnerved. "I don't know, but honestly, man, that's more than a bit creepy." I shot one last glance. The kid hadn't even blinked once. He was just staring with an off-putting intensity out the glass. "Come on, let's get out of here," Craig said, echoing the thoughts swimming through my mind. I put the car into first gear and eased off the clutch, the car beginning to roll forward. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him turn and shoot the bird at the kid as we slid out from under the lights into the dark. "Prick," I heard him mumble. I turned the car left and began heading back the way we came. Well, the good thing is, I did find out where we are. I pulled the map from my pocket and handed it to my friend. I heard him fumbling for a moment, and then a small flashlight clicked on as he aimed it at the map. "Dude, how did we make it almost as far east as Placer?" he asked with a slightly astonished tone. "Longer drive than normal, I guess," I answered, rolling down my window to flick the ashes from my smoke out. I shot a glance at the analog clock on the dashboard. 2:45 it read. I let out a small sigh. Great, Vanessa is likely worrying up a storm about us right now. Me, especially. Ever since we'd started dating 5 years ago, my girlfriend had always been rather apprehensive about my habit of taking long, late-night drives when I couldn't sleep. She always feared I'd get into an accident, either with another car, wrap my Honda around a tree, or hit an animal. Most of the time, I'd come home to find her sitting up waiting for me, worry clearly etched into her beautiful sapphire eyes. I bit my lip slightly. "Hey, you think I should text Vanessa and let her know we're okay?" I asked Craig. I heard him let out a snort. "Honestly, bro, no. I know the woman loves you to death, and I'm happy she cares so much. But she's got to learn you know what you're doing. Plus, you two need your space. It's not healthy how much time you two spend together." I flicked the remnants of the cigarette out the window and let out a snort of my own. "It's called being in love, dude. You should try it sometime," I joked, causing him to let out a laugh. "Nah, thanks. I enjoy being single too much." Shaking my head, I stared out the windshield as the headlights guided our way. I felt a slight sense of unease creep up on me as I watched the 2-lane road stretch out before us, the moon in the sky almost completely blocked by the trees over our heads. I hadn't seen another car on the road for 2 hours at least. Well, what'd you expect, Derek? You drove into the boonies. There's only ghost towns out here. Why don't you try driving all the way to Idaho next time? Shaking my thoughts away, I fumbled in the center console for a moment before pulling out a mixtape. A bit of music would help me feel better. I pushed it into the car's cassette player and hit play. A moment later, the pounding bass and synths of Dance with the Dead's That House began blasting from the speakers. Craig let out a whoop of excitement. "Dude, yes, that's the kind of tunes we need for a drive like this." He rolled down the passenger window, sticking his head out the window to whoop and holler into the night. I shook my head, unable to keep from grinning at his antics. Friggin' goofball. The playful mood helped settle my mind, and I felt myself relax into the seat, the tension flowing out of my body and out the window. For a few minutes, that's how things went. The road stretching out ahead of us and then disappearing into the blackness behind us, the music blasting out from the radio and the soft roar of the engine in the background. I shot another look at the backlit clock. Now it read 5 minutes to 3. We should be at the highway in a minute. The thought released the last wisps of tension in my body and fumbled into the back seat for the bag, catching it with the tips of my fingers. I pulled my bottle of soda from it and, holding the bottle to the steering wheel, cracked the cap. I lifted it to my lips and took a swig, taking my eyes off the road for a split second to tilt my head back. I looked back at the road and nearly spit it all out onto the windshield. In the second I'd stopped looking, a figure had stepped out onto the road. "Fucking hell!" I shouted, jamming my feet on the brake and clutch as hard as I could. The rear wheels of the car locked up, and the ear-piercing sound of squealing tires filled the cabin. To my horror, the tail end of the car began sliding out. Oh, hell, no, 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 no. For a few seconds, the world around us became a blur of shapes and colors, and I feared at any moment we'd smash into a tree or begin rolling. Thankfully, the car finally came to a stop with a screech of protest from the suspension. We were facing back the way we'd come. I could tell from the black lines on the road which had once been the rubber of my tires. I gripped the steering wheel with almost a death grip, my heart furiously pounding in my chest. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps. There was no movement in the car for a few seconds before Craig reached forward and snapped the music off. "Dude, what the folk?" he shouted at me, his face looking as pale as mine must be. I didn't say a word to him. Instead, I pulled up on the handbrake, ripped off my seatbelt, and practically kicked the door open. Stepping out onto the pavement, I stepped to the front of the car on unsteady legs until I was squarely in between the headlight beams. I looked around, first at the road ahead, then at the forest on either side. There was nothing there. What the? I turned and looked behind me, over the roof of the car. The red glow of the taillights illuminated a few feet ahead, but beyond that, nothing but blackness. I turned again, looking out at the darkness beyond the branches. No movement disturbed the bushes and branches, and aside from the quiet hum of the car's engine, it was silent. I shook my head. Did I just imagine things? I shook it again. No, I know for a fact I didn't hallucinate. There was someone there. The sound of the car door opening made me turn, seeing Craig step out of the car. Leaving the door open, he immediately came over to me. "You have exactly 20 seconds to explain to me what the hell just happened before I lose it, bro," he exclaimed. For a second, I fought to find my voice, then I answered. Dude, I'm not crazy. Someone stepped out of the woods and onto the road. It looked like a chick. I thought I was gonna freaking hit her." I realized I'd been holding in a breath and let it out, trying desperately to get myself to relax. Craig gave me a confused look. "You serious, man?" I nodded. He pulled the flashlight he'd used to look at the map from his pocket and flicked it on, aiming it first at the tree line on one side of the road, then the other. After doing this a few times, he turned back to me. Well, whoever it was, they're not there anymore. His brow furrowed. But why would a chick be out here in the middle of nowhere? He muttered, more to himself than me. I still answered, I don't know, man. It's freaking Josephine County. For as many good people live out here, there's also a bunch of weirdos. I heard my friend let out a snort of laughter in reply, but something had caught my attention. A feeling which had slammed into me with all the weight of a Peterbilt. The feeling of eyes boring into the back of my skull. I spun around, looking back towards the car and seeing nothing there. But the feeling remained, and I didn't like it one bit. Especially when the feeling came again, this time from the direction I'd just been facing a moment ago. Realization dawned on me, and I felt a shiver shoot up my spine, along with the flicker of fear. Oh, shit, I whispered. Craig turned to look at me. What? He asked, seeing the look on my face. He repeated, What? I looked up at him, speaking with a bit of a weak voice. Let's get back in the car right now. He didn't argue, thankfully. He was already moving for the open passenger door, and I matched his pace as the feeling of being watched intensified, as if someone were rapidly approaching from the woods. Oh, hell. I broke, first into a run, then a full-out sprint for the last 10 feet, tearing at the door handle and practically launching myself into the driver's seat. Slamming the door closed behind me, I jammed down on the door lock, seeing Craig do the same. He turned to me, his face hidden in the dark, but his voice giving a perfect mental image of it. What the hell was that man? The tone of it gave away the fact he'd felt, even for the briefest of moments, the same feeling of dread and fear I'd had. You remember those videos of people driving on empty roads in the middle of the night, only to have someone step into the road and get them to stop? I asked. A sharp intake of breath came from the passenger seat before he answered, finishing my thought. And then a bunch of people spring out of the woods trying to ambush them. Oh, hell no. My thoughts exactly. Time to friggin' leave. I released the parking brake, pulling on my seatbelt and jamming the car into first gear. The tires chirped as I hit the gas, and a moment later we were accelerating away. As we did, the feeling of being watched rapidly fell away to nothing, and I allowed myself to let out a relieved sigh. We drove in silence for another few minutes before I finally spoke again. I think we're in the clear, man. Craig let out a soft laugh. Thank folk for that. I nodded, then reached for the soda which had fallen, wedging itself by the parking brake. Snatching it up, I uncapped it and took another swig, the still cool liquid feeling amazing going down my throat. Recapping and dropping it behind me into the back seat, I let a laugh of my own. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, Craig, but I think after this I may take a bit of a break from late-night drives for a bit. This just got under my skin too much. For a few moments, longer than I thought, there was nothing, and then he answered. As much as that sucks, bro, I can understand. No problem at all. I thought I could detect a small tone of sadness in his voice, along with something else I couldn't place, but then I heard him sit up straight. Hey, Jake? He asked, a bit of a concerned tone now etched into it. Yeah? I heard him draw another breath. Shouldn't we be to the highway by now, or at least see the lights of passing cars? I hadn't been fully concentrating on anything except the next stretch of road in my headlights, but at his words, I jerked my head to look beyond them. What the actual hell? He was right. The lights of cars and trucks flashing by on the freeway should be visible through the dark. I clearly remembered looking in my side view mirror as we'd turned onto the road from the highway, seeing the ever-present white and red glows zipping by both ways at close to the same distance we were now. That wasn't the case anymore. All I could see in front of us was darkness. Darkness and the woods on either side of the road. For a moment, I lifted my foot off the accelerator, letting the car slow down a little as my brain whirred. He's gotta be mistaken. Hell, I've gotta be mistaken. We just haven't gotten close enough to the highway yet. You know these old roads, Derek. They often end up longer than they first look. Feeling somewhat relieved by the thought, I said it out loud to Craig. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. And, for that matter, as much as I repeated it mentally to myself, I couldn't completely convince myself either. It was as if seeing the woman step in the road had shaken me more than I'd first thought. Pushing back down on the gas, I shifted into fourth gear and watched the speedometer flirt with 55 miles an hour. For a few minutes more, neither one of us saw anything as we drove in silence. And then Craig let out a cry. "There! A light!" For a moment, a surge of hope welled up inside me, and I craned over the steering wheel looking to see the highway. It was dashed as I saw it was only a streetlight, standing solitary guard on the side of the road like a sentry. Beneath it stood an old worn sign which seemed to have been shot at many times with both BB pellets and actual bullets. I slowed the car some as it came towards us so I could read it, and felt a wave of confusion fall over me. Golden, 2 miles. The folk? Craig breathed out as he read the sign. It passed by us, the streetlight momentarily bathing the interior of the car in light and showing the confused, worried look on his face. How the hell did we end up by Golden? Golden is a ghost town, one which attracts visitors every year to check out the standing buildings. It was a mining town which had a population of a few hundred people, but once the prospects dried up in the early to mid-20th century, it became the ghost town it is today. Its biggest claim to fame nowadays was being featured on Ghost Adventures a few years back. Craig repeated his question, but I wasn't able to answer him. My thoughts were racing inside my head. There's no freaking way. Golden is miles to the north of Placer. There are no roads connecting the two areas, from what I saw on the map. Not to mention, we've been driving in a straight line since leaving the gas station. I honestly don't know, man, I finally answered, my voice conveying how rattled I truly was. In the car's dark interior, I saw him put his head in his hands. I fumbled for my pack of cigarettes, pulling another out with slightly unsteady fingers and pushing in the cigarette lighter. A moment later, the turnoff for the ghost town flashed by on the right. I saw the dark, hulking shape of the church's spire rising out of the dark for a moment. Then it was behind us. The lighter popped out, and I pressed it to the smoke, lighting it and putting it back. I decided I needed to try and calm the rising tension that was filling the car's interior. Look, however we ended up here, man, the fact is, we can't be far now from the highway. So, let's just keep our wits about us, keep calm, and when we get back to my place, you, me, and Vanessa can have a good laugh over this. Sound good? I heard my friend take a deep breath, then let it out in a whoosh. Okay, yeah, that sounds like a plan. He let out a soft laugh, and I felt him pat my shoulder. Thanks, Derek. You are seriously a good friend. Glad I've got you. I nodded, then realized he may not be able to see it in the dark. No problem, man, I said. I looked at the clock, 3 a.m. Only 5 minutes had passed since I'd last looked at it. And yet, it felt more like it had been 30. Times seems different when you're stressed. For a few minutes, there was only darkness. And then, a light appeared in the distance. Ha! There we go! I exclaimed. I waited to see the sign for the on-ramp appear, and felt a shiver shoot up my spine as the sign for Golden flew by again. That's... what? Craig didn't say anything, but I felt him stiffen in the passenger seat, showing he'd seen it as well. As the streetlight and sign disappeared behind us, a feeling began to creep up on me. Another shiver shot up my spine as I realized that it was the same feeling I'd had when we'd gotten out of the car. The feeling of eyes on me. My eyes shifted to the blur of trees on either side of the car, but I saw no one out there. The turnoff for the ghost town approached again. I heard Craig let out another deep breath. "Derek, pull over, please," he said simply. His voice was shaking, and as much as I didn't want to stop, I did as he asked, pulling over just before the turnoff. He ripped his seatbelt off, shoving the door open and stepping out. I watched him stride to the front of the car and stand there for a minute. He seemed to start shaking a bit, and I realized just how much this was getting to him. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle when I glanced at the clock and froze. The clock was still showing 3 a.m. The hands hadn't moved at all. A feeling of shock washed over me like a wave as I tapped it with my fingers to see if it was merely stuck, but it refused to begin moving again. "Okay, what the actual folk is going on?" I whispered to myself. I reached into my pocket, fishing out my phone and turning on the screen. Like the clock, it, too, showed the time as 3 a.m. The feeling of being watched began to intensify, and I glanced at Craig standing in the dark before looking down, beginning to type a text out to Vanessa. "Hey, baby girl, just wanted to let you know that Craig and I are okay. We're trying to get back to the highway, but have gotten a bit turned around out here. Do me a favor, and if I don't text you again in 15 minutes, text me back, okay? I love you." I replaced the phone in my pocket. I knew I should have been more honest, but I was beginning to feel a little freaked out about the weird situation. I didn't want to worry her any more than necessary, as it would make me start to freak out worse. Pushing open the door, I got out and walked around, stopping near the front right headlight. "Dude, you all right?" I asked him after a moment. He didn't answer, but happily, he seemed to have stopped shaking. I repeated my question. When he didn't answer my second and third calls, I began to feel a new sensation creep up on me, a potent mixture of dread and fear. "Craig, dude, you're creeping me the folk out. Please say something." He finally turned to look at me, and in the semi-glow of the headlights, I saw his face had gone a bit pale. He raised a finger and pointed, saying only a single word. "Look." My eyes followed where he had gestured, and I began to feel like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. The cigarette dangling from my lips fell from my mouth to the ground. Standing about 50 feet away, just inside the tree line, was a figure. It was drenched in gloom, but with a gasp, I realized it was the same woman who'd nearly caused me to wreck. "Oh, folk me sideways, man." I swallowed, finding my voice. We should get back in the car, Craig." He nodded almost immediately. "I think you might be right," he answered, his voice wavering. Not taking our eyes off the figure, we slowly backed up until we reached our respective doors and climbed in. I didn't even bother pulling my seatbelt on. I just jammed the gear shifter into first and floored it. Dirt and gravel kicked out behind us, and the car shot forward onto the road. This time, I didn't let up on the gas. I kept my foot hard down, the engine beginning to roar as I shifted into third and fourth. The speedometer reached 60 as I shifted into fifth gear, the feeling of being watched intensifying with each passing second. I prayed that I would see something, anything ahead of us. An intersection, a house, a freaking out-of-use payphone, for folks' sake. And then my blood turned to ice as a light appeared ahead of us. The exact same one as before, with the sign underneath. My eyes flickered to the clock, and terror shot through me as I saw it still was frozen at the same time. "This isn't good, bro," Craig said from the passenger seat. I agreed with him, but didn't say it out loud. I kept my foot to the floor, the speedometer now hitting 80. The turnoff appeared again, and what I saw made me want to scream. The woman had gotten closer to the road, and she wasn't alone anymore. Behind her, I saw others, the outlines of other people, dozens, possibly more. They all stood facing the road, watching us fly by, and then they disappeared into the rear-view mirror. "Folk," I breathed out, as the light and sign flashed by yet again. This time, the mass of people had gotten even closer to the road. The woman stood in front of them all, and for a split second, the headlights illuminated her. Another flash of ice shot through my veins as I saw the river of blood pouring down the front of her nightgown, one that looked to be decades old. "What the hell do we do?" Craig asked me, his voice steady, yet filled with fear, the same I felt. I just shook my head. "I don't know, man," was all I could say. The street light began to appear again when I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, causing me to nearly slam on the brakes in surprise. I fumbled in my pocket for it, seeing Craig look over at me. I texted Vanessa when we stopped, told her to reply back in a few minutes. Now, I think I'm going to tell her to call the cops or something. He didn't reply, instead turning to look out the windshield at the approaching light. Flicking my eyes from the phone screen to the road and back, I forced myself to not look at the turnoff as we zoomed past the light. I didn't want to see how close those ghosts, demons, whatever they were, had gotten to the road. I flipped my finger, pushing away the lock screen and tapping on the messenger icon as the light began to appear once more. Vanessa's message automatically opened, and for a moment, relief, like I'd never felt, surged through me at the small bit of normalcy I had in my grasp. I froze. I didn't even look up at the road. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the single sentence, reading and rereading it. A wave of confusion passed over me. Enough I spoke aloud. "The folk?" Craig spoke up. What'd she say?" I didn't answer him. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, trying to understand, but it was like I was hitting a mental wall. I tried to think of something else as another thought came to me. But again, the same block was coming to me. As it did, a new wave of fear began to rise up in me. One for an entirely new reason than the terrifying loop flying by outside. The speedometer now showed we were doing 90. And then Craig spoke. "Can I ask you a question, man?" Ice filled every vein in my body. Not at his question, but at his voice. It was different. Gone was the fear and tension he'd had not even a minute ago. Now, he just sounded flat. No. Not flat. I couldn't tell why, but the way his tone was, it almost made me feel like he was smiling. Another shiver cascaded up my spine as I finally forced myself to answer, my mouth dry as cotton. "What?" he answered as we began to fly under the streetlight. "Are you scared?" For whatever reason, the question made me turn to look at him, just as the light whizzed over us. For a split second, the car's interior became illuminated again. My eyes locked with his. The light flew by. The turnoff appeared again, and for a moment, my eyes flicked up to see that the woman was right next to the road, bathed completely in the headlights. I finally caught a glimpse of her face, and then I was screaming, my fingers tearing at the door handle as the car swerved to the right. I saw a tree flying towards the windshield. I didn't think, I just forced the door open and leapt out. The ground rapidly flew up to meet me. Darkness. I woke up in a hospital room, a bandage covering my head, and one arm in a sling. My chest felt like it was on fire as well. The first thing I saw was Vanessa, who, upon seeing me wake up, burst into tears and wrapped her arm around me. A few moments later, the doctor came in. He told me that I was a lucky man. Apparently, I'd gotten away with only a gash in my head, requiring staples, severely bruised ribs, and a broken arm. Shocking for having dove out of a car at what appeared to be tremendous speed, he said, raising an eyebrow. Then he told me the police wanted to speak to me. He showed them in, and 2 officers entered, asking me many questions. I told them exactly what had happened, well, except for 2 small details anyways. They appeared to take my account seriously and promised to look into it. "We've had some reports similar to yours, sir," one of them answered tentatively. Then they told me how I'd been found. How a father and son who owned a gas station nearby had been out driving and had come across first my destroyed Honda, which had wrapped itself around a tree and then some, and then lying unconscious in the grassy ditch, me. They didn't say who they'd been, but I had a fair idea who they'd been. At least the son, anyways. That night was 3 months ago. I've been at home, resting and healing this entire time. It's given me plenty of time to think, plenty of time to process everything. I try not to think about that night, about any of it. I feel like I'll go insane if I do. Especially after the police told me that they found nobody else at the scene of the wreck, only the passenger door hanging open. But I've had to, after receiving an email from an unknown address. One claiming to be the son, the kid I saw in the gas station that night. He told me things that his father told him he'd seen for years, that he didn't believe at all, until that night. When he looked out the door at my car, that's when he'd frantically called his father. As I type this out, I feel myself begin to violently shake, remembering the woman's face, indeed a ghost, as it flashed in the headlights. The look of horror plastered there as she frantically waved at me to get my attention. The same look the others must have had, remembering turning to look at Craig as the light flickered over and seeing the smile on his face. A smile wider than any human being's could possibly be, filled with shark-like teeth as black eyes stared hungrily at me. The same shark-like smile the kid told me he'd been flashed as I'd pulled away. But mostly, I remember the single line of text Vanessa sent me. What caused me to rack my brain, trying frantically to recall my friendship with the figure sitting opposite me, and horror filling me as I realized I couldn't think of one single memory. What will keep me from ever taking late-night drives again? The 3 words that will remain burned into my memory forever. Darling, who's Craig? I had always loved driving at night. When I'd first learned to drive, I would steal my old man's car and go roaring down the rural back roads early in the morning. It gave me a sense of freedom. I had meant to set off at 8, but instead, I didn't start my long drive back until gone 10. I'd been out of town for a week, meeting some old friends and reliving the past. It was a 7-hour drive down, but that was during the day. Without any traffic, the drive should cut down to around 5 hours, tops. That was another reason I loved driving at night. I was a nervous driver when I was on the open freeway. In those moments, my safety depended on the competence of others, and I just had no faith in the competence of others. That night, I had barely met 2 cars before I had to pull over, the fuel gauge dancing worryingly close to E. I turned into a shitty little gas station that was still a few miles out from the edge of town. Some teenagers were working the till. He had school books splayed out on the counter and he was barely awake. He jumped when I walked in. I bought a packet of apple-flavored gum and put $30 on the tank. I walked out of the artificially lit convenience store and to the darkness surrounding my car. I drove a 1971 Plymouth Barracuda. She was my pride and joy. As I gently filled her up, I subconsciously rested my eyes. I jolted back to lucidity just before I fully fell asleep. I realized I had overshot it and went back into the store to pay. The kid was gone, probably on a toilet break, judging from the cans of Red Bull piled around his textbooks, so I left $10 by the register and called it a day. I got back in my car and got ready for the final stretch of the journey. Around 15 minutes later, I passed another car. It was a white sedan, fresh out of the 1980s. It was the type of car I would have whistled at if it drove by me in the street. On either side of the road was a thick forest, as impenetrable as the darkness just outside of the range of my headlights. I was used to a lack of sleep, but this was starting to get to me. I was chewing gum and listening to the radio. All it picked out was static, but that was better than silence. I had half a thermos of coffee resting on the back seat. I was planning on saving it for later on in the journey, but I had almost forgotten about it. As my eyelids became heavier, I took one hand off the wheel and tried to reach for the flask behind me. Still focusing on the road, I groped for it, but to no avail. My hand brushed past the cold metal, but I couldn't quite seem to grasp it. I exhaled and turned around. I saw the damn thing resting in between the two back seats. I reached over a little and grabbed it, and that's when it happened. I saw something streak across my windshield out of my peripheral vision. A great weight struck the car as I span around and stamped my foot on the brake so hard I thought the pedal would buckle under the force. My car came to a screeching halt. I sat there for a minute, my hands holding onto the wheel so hard my knuckles were turning white, and I tried to get my breathing under control. I thought about driving on and not looking back, happy to think I'd just hit an unfortunate deer and left it at that. I had hit a deer back in '98. This place was crawling with them, and they seemed almost suicidal, the amount of them that jump in front of cars this time of year. But I decided against that, and, racked with anxiety, I got out of my car. Laying on the cold gravel of the road was a body. A human body. I stared in horror as I realized what I had done. His legs were a crumpled mess. His right arm was bent at an impossible angle, and his head... Oh God, his head bore the brunt of the force. It was bisected down the middle. His face was gone, unrecognizable, and clumps of gray matter oozed out from between two shards of his skull. The old black frock jacket he had been wearing was now filled with his blood. My front headlight had shattered. I felt a twinge of guilt checking what damage was done to my car. It should have been the least of my worries, I know. As bad as it is to say, I was planning on leaving the body right there, driving home and forgetting about the night with the help of my good friend Jack Daniels. But then I heard the low rumble of a motor. A car was coming. I was in fight or flight mode, and I did the first thing that made sense at the time. I had an old blanket in the trunk, laid out for my dog when we went to the beach. It stunk of wet dog, but somehow I didn't think the body would mind. I rolled it out in the road and pushed the new corpse onto it as the headlights of the oncoming car neared. The contents of his head were spilling out everywhere, so I grabbed a plastic target bag and wrapped it around his head, keeping everything in one place. I lifted the body, and to my surprise, he was unusually light. It felt like lifting a small child. I cursed myself for falling in love with a car with such little space in the trunk as I crammed the body inside, closing it just as I was illuminated by a station wagon's headlights. To my horror, it did not keep going. It came to a halt next to me, and the driver started to roll down his window. Instead of accusing me of murder, the tired-looking driver asked me for directions. I saw his wife sitting in the passenger seat. His 3 kids were in the back. All of them were asleep. The man asked me for directions to the nearest motel. The nearest one I could think of was a cheap shithole called Sir Sleep-A-Lot. I had stayed there when my marriage was on the rocks, just before the divorce. I told him he had missed the turn for it, and he had to turn around, drive for 1.5 miles, take a left, then keep driving for another 2 miles. He smiled wearily and thanked me. He started to wind his window back up when he stopped. I was turning back to my car when he asked me if I had broken down and needed any help. I assured him I was fine. He thanked me again and took off into the night. I got back into the driver's seat and just sat there for a while, thinking about what I should do. I must have spent almost an hour shivering in my seat, weighing my options. I've listened to enough true crime podcasts to know how to hide a body, but I didn't think I could stomach dismembering him. But I knew what I had to do. I started my car up and began the last leg of my journey. I passed the moss-covered sign welcoming me back to my hometown. I drove through the empty streets, each house occupied by a sleeping family. I pulled into my street just on the edge of the suburbs. I realized, for the first time, that my hands were shaking. I tried to get it under control as I parked in my driveway and got out, stretching my weary legs. I made my way to the trunk and opened it. I half hoped the body wouldn't be there, and that this had all been some fever dream I had at the wheel. But of course it was still there, stained in blood and crumpled into the fetal position. Still wrapped in my dog's blanket, and with a plastic bag bearing the Target logo keeping his head in one place. I leaned in to lift him out. As I did, a voice behind me said, with little emotion, "Hello." I whipped around. Standing by his car on the other side of the fence was my neighbor, a religious but sweet guy called Gary. I always saw him as my very own Ned Flanders. I slammed my trunk shut and nonchalantly leaned against it. I greeted him, and we both just stood there awkwardly for what felt like a lifetime. Eventually, Gary said, "Well, see you later," before turning and getting in his car. I stood where I was and watched him drive off until he was out of sight. I wondered what he could be doing at 4:30 in the morning, but it felt weird of me to be suspicious of someone when I was about to bury the body of a man I had just killed. I made sure there were no other nocturnal neighbors around, and I opened my trunk once again. I picked up the strangely light corpse and nudged the trunk shut with my elbow. I hastily walked over to my front door and set the body down, fumbling with my keys. I opened the door and dragged him inside. I pulled him across the carpet, wincing at the mess I had to clean up, and to the basement door. I opened it and gently brought him down the rotting wooden steps. There was a patch of dirt in the corner of my basement, where an old washing machine had been. I kept meaning to cement it over, but, thankfully, never got around to it. I lay the body down next to the dirt patch. I rolled him out of the blanket and got a good look at him for the first time. Not that I particularly wanted to. I bunched up the blood-stained blanket and set it down on a workbench I never used. My sister had been looking after my dog Lassie while I was away. I was supposed to pick her up tomorrow, but I didn't fancy the idea of digging up the remains. Since I didn't have a shed, I kept a shovel in the same little room under the stairs where I kept the boiler. As I walked back up the basement stairs, I realized my shake was back. The brevity of what I was about to do was taking hold. I made a B-turn to the kitchen and fumbled with the lock on my liquor cabinet. I took out a half-empty bottle of 90 proof and slumped into an old oak chair, the sole inheritance from my grandfather. Once it was finished, I began to reason with myself. I thought the man I killed might have been the person who was responsible for the recent spate of disappearances. A serial killer who was stalking the back roads late at night, who fell victim to a weary driver. If this was true, then what I had done was a net positive to the world, so I clung to that thought. That's when I heard a noise. It was the type of noise you'd hear as you were drifting off to sleep. The type of noise that'd tear you back into lucidity. I heard it again. It sounded like it was coming from the basement. I put the bottle down and made my way out of the kitchen. I stood in front of the basement door, waiting to see if I could hear it again. I must have stood there for a minute or two in perfect silence. I took a deep breath and grabbed the shovel from the cramped storeroom. Either way, it was time for me to do what needed to be done. With a heavy heart, I opened the door. Standing amongst the shadows at the foot of the stairs was the body. I realized, to my horror, that the noise I heard was the thing's bones snapping back into place. It stood there, staring up at me. It still had the plastic bag over its head, but I could tell it was staring directly into my eyes. I let out a whimper and took a step back. The body let out a shrill scream as its feet left the ground. It floated there for a second as I was frozen from shock. The body jerked and came hurtling up the stairs. I was snapped out of my trance and acted quickly enough to slam the door shut. The force that hit it from the other side shook the hinges. I gritted my teeth, desperately trying to hold the door shut as the body pounded it and snarled from the other side. I looked down at the shovel by my side. I took a hand away from the door to grab it, and as soon as I did, I felt the weight hit me. I almost let it loose from the basement. I grabbed the shovel and wedged it in between the door and the wall behind me. I mustered up enough courage to let go of the door and winced. Thankfully, the shovel was enough to keep it in place. I hopped over the spade, ran past the blood-stained carpet, and, stupidly, ran past the front door. Instead, I went upstairs to my bedroom. I staggered to my closet and dropped to my knees. I took out the Webley revolver my father gave me when I first moved out. I kept it, along with some loose ammunition wrapped in a piece of tinfoil in a shoebox. I hastily loaded it and got to my feet. I held it like I had seen in the detective films. All I know about guns is they shoot. I never learned how to use them properly, never thought I needed to. I made my way down the landing and crouched when I got to the stairs. I warily took 3 steps down to get a view of the basement's entrance. The door was wide open. The shovel had been snapped in half. I raised my gun and pointed at the shadows in the area where I thought the body might be. It felt weird calling it a body, but I didn't know what else to say. I kept my gun level, but heard a noise slowly getting louder. It sounded like a flock of birds landing on the roof. I looked around for its source and saw it. The body was crawling upside down on the ceiling. It had just crawled out of the doorway from the dining room into the living room and was coming straight for me. I stumbled backwards and ran back into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I hid under my bed and held my breath. I heard the body take dull, methodical steps until it stopped directly outside of my door. I fought the urge to scream. From my little hiding spot, I saw my bedroom door slowly creaking open, and the body walked in. All I could see of it was its feet, which were clubbed and malformed like a polio victim. Its skin was bone white and dotted with dark purple pustules. Each step looked more painful than the last as it walked around my room. Its breathing was labored and muffled slightly by the plastic bag that it still hadn't taken from its face. I did not move a muscle. I was paralyzed with fear. I don't think I even breathed. I watched it hobble around my bedroom until it was satisfied I was nowhere to be found. It slowly turned around and walked back out. I stayed where I was for a few minutes, trying desperately to think of what to do next. I calmed myself, got my shaking under control, and rolled out from under the bed. The body was floating in the middle of my room, a meter or so off the ground. It was hunched over where it met the ceiling and looked directly at me. It dived towards me and I fired blindly. I was inexperienced with using a gun, but I was so close to it was almost impossible to miss. All 5 shots hit their target. The body faltered in the air and slammed into my bedside cabinet. I got to my feet and scrambled to my door. I looked back to see the body convulsing. I ran in abject terror and made my way down the stairs in a controlled fall. I hadn't even reached the ground floor before the body came hurtling out of my room, flying through the air as if something had thrown it. I grabbed my keys from the little ceramic bowl by the front door and fumbled with them until I found the right one. I burst out of my house and ran frantically down the driveway to my car. I opened the door and fell into the driver's seat. When I looked up, I saw the body standing in the doorway of my house. It slowly reached for its face and ripped the plastic shopping bag off. I wish it hadn't. The body flung itself at the car, just as I got the engine going. It latched onto the hood and let out a guttural cry as it started to violently headbutt the windscreen. I pulled into the street and drove blindly into the night. Cracks appeared on the glass, and I feared it would shatter. Its forehead was bleeding now, but it didn't seem to care. It was then I got a good look at its face. Its skin was a tallow white, with the mottled texture of chronic rheumatism. Its eyes were pure black, bulging from its head as if they were to fall out and leaking vile pus from the edges. Its nose and ears looked like they had been gnarled off by a rabid dog, leaving only scared, shapeless stumps. The thing's gums were necrotic. Its teeth were shattered and ripping through exposed nerves, all but the front canines, which seemed dagger-like and immaculate. I hit the brakes. The body flew from the hood and skidded across the tarmac road, degloving any exposed skin as it slid, leaving a trail of blood behind it. I revved my car before driving over the body for the second time that night. I stopped and collected myself. I took a deep breath in and another out. I held the steering wheel tightly and focused my mind. As I was calming myself, I saw something move from out of the corner of my eye. I looked in the wing mirror to see the body slowly rise to its feet. I turned around in my seat and stared slack-jawed at it. It looked back at me before dropping to all fours. I watched as it scurried down the street to my house. It looked back at me one more time as it stood up and calmly walked into my home, the front door slamming shut behind it. At this point, a few neighbors had woken up. From the sirens in the distance, I knew at least one had phoned 911. I drove to the outskirts of town, parked up the bridge, and slept for the first time in what felt like a week. I woke up to a teenager banging on my door, laughing as I jolted awake and running off to continue his walk to school. On a tank of fumes, I made my way to my sister's. I write to you now from her guest room, my dog Lassie curled up at my feet. I planned on going back to my house. My sister had convinced me that most of what happened that night was just a weird experience. I've always suffered with insomnia. Even from a young age like 9 or 12, it's always plagued me. I usually just stay up doing meditative things until I fall asleep. That's before I got my car and driver's license. Now I just take long drives to the rural parts of my county where the woods and farmland are. No one is ever out on the road, so it's very peaceful. With that being said, it doesn't mean I'm alone on those dirt roads. The things I've seen have both horrified and intrigued me. I'll share a few experiences I have had on these stretches of lonely road. The figure. During one of my late-night drives, I went further than I usually do. The road gets older and more overgrown in those parts. It basically leads to a very ancient forest with nothing but tire marks as a road. I'm driving, and all of a sudden I catch something in my headlights. A tall humanoid figure covered up by the bushes, facing a tree with its arms by its side, Blair Witch style. I've seen stuff like this before, so I just take a mental note of it and continue on exploring. For context, the things you encounter out here at night aren't necessarily hostile. They won't mess with you if you don't mess with them. I didn't see that particular figure for the rest of the night, and I didn't get a good look at them because of the bushes covering them. All I knew at the time is that they were tall as shit. I'm talking making basketball players look scrawny. Other than its freakish height, the proportions were all out of whack. One shoulder was huge and beefy but had a twig-like arm attached to it, and the other shoulder was thin but had a bodybuilder arm at the end of it. That night was pretty uneventful, so I decided to head back early and try to sleep. The next night was much more interesting. As per usual, I couldn't sleep, so I hopped on my car and drove to the rural dirt roads. I decided to head back into those deep woods to see if I could see that weird, tall figure again. I'm driving slowly down this forest for 30 minutes, radio off, dead silent woods, and I don't see a thing, which is pretty uncommon not to see something weird. I closed my eyes and sighed, running my fingers through my hair. When I opened them, the figure was there. Misshapen body, arms at its sides, facing the opposite direction. It was directly in front of my headlights, and I got a better look at it. This thing was wearing a filthy dark green trench coat with some torn brown jeans and boots splattered with mud. The figure's legs were also misshapen and uneven. One leg was swollen and was as thick as a car tire, while the other leg was literally just skin and bones. The hair on the back of its head waxed patchy and looked like a failed buzz cut. It stretched out its skinny arm like it was getting ready to point at something to the side. The figure's hands made finger scissors that opened and closed. I sat there, completely in shock. My heart sank with the realization. It was mocking me. A while back in school, I got bullied by this asshole who called me Snip Snip and would constantly make the same scissoring motion with his fingers. He called me this because, well, I'm a trans girl. I grunted in anger and gestured for this thing to move to the side. Its back was facing me, so it didn't see. I had serious thoughts of running this thing over, but I remembered. If I don't mess with them, they won't harm me. I just drove around it and didn't dare look in the rearview mirror to see its face. It was facing backwards for a reason. I still see it from time to time, and it always is mocking me with gestures, mimicking something painful from my past. Sign language to mock my sibling who went deaf from an infection, waving a fist around violently to reference my physical ex, the gesture of holding a cigarette to make fun of my aunt who died of lung cancer, etc. This thing really just pisses me off more than anything. Its mutated-ass body is kind of unnerving, though. The Eater is a pretty common one to see on those roads at night. My first encounter with it was just like all the other times I see this thing. It's semi-humanoid with pitch-black skin and a very obese frame. It walks on all fours like a gorilla. It has tiny claws for hands. Its face is like a leech with dead, glazed-over eyes on the sides of its neck. And the gross thing has a long tongue. I'll see it early on in my drives. The Eater is usually crouched over a corpse of a dead animal with a chunk of the carcass's meat in its tiny hands. The Eater just licks the meat with that huge tongue. It just laps up gore and blood. I don't think it hunts. It's more of a scavenger. The Eater is very docile and gets kind of curious when I pass by. It doesn't get too close, though. Sometimes I'll throw some leftover dinner I have into the tall grasses for it. I still wouldn't touch it if you folking paid me. Live and let live is what I've learned in these places. Skinless. Skinless is one of the more dangerous things out in those woods. Whenever I see her, I immediately turn around and go straight home. She's a skinless woman, hence the name, in a white dress soaked in blood. Her flayed body is always bleeding, and she has a large butcher's knife clenched in her hand. She appears in the tall grass and will stumble towards your car slowly. She's slow, but she will catch up eventually. Skinless will stand by your driver's side window and tap her knife against the glass. She'll ask you if she's beautiful in a voice that echoes through your soul. It sounds like a much more demonic voice is speaking under hers. If you lock eyes with Skinless, you'll have the uncontrollable urge to gag or throw up. If you do throw up or gag, she'll violently smash your window and try to flay your skin off. I've only had this happen once, and I managed to speed off before she could shatter the window. She kept screaming about how she will skin me alive. If you do basically anything, she'll kill you. I haven't really bothered to try saying yes because it's nearly impossible with the crippling fear and that sick feeling you get in your stomach. Your best option is to just drive away before she catches up. Once you get out of those grasses into civilization, you're pretty much fine. I may write about my first encounter with Skinless in a separate post. If you see her in the distance, just turn around and don't look back. Headlights. This is by far the most dangerous creature I've encountered on my drives. If you see this thing, you better go as fast as you can in the other direction and pray to every single goddamn deity you know. I almost stopped going on drives after I met this thing. Last month, I was on a drive that was eerily calm. There was nothing. No wind, no rustling, not even any strange apparitions. I thought it was strange and slowed down slightly while driving, my eyes darting to every corner of the tall grass and the forest. There was absolutely nothing. Skinless usually scares off some other entities and animals, but she only appears once every couple of weeks. This was different. This continued until I reached an old farm at the edge of the tall grass. I usually pull to a crawl and look at the barn. Sometimes there are shadows or a strange ram-like creature that walks by the windows. Nothing walked by the windows. Strangely, the absence of any horrible monster was making me afraid. That's when I saw it. 2 huge headlights stabbing my eyes like 2 suns. I heard the rumbling sputter of a damaged engine. In front of me was a 1940s-style truck painted completely black. A sense of impending death fell over me like a macabre blanket, and I quickly fumbled with the stick shift to put my car in reverse. I nearly floored it as a scream erupted from inside the truck. The scream was not of this world. It ripped all the joy I had in my heart out and into the starless night. Whatever was driving that thing was pure evil. It was an ancient force of malice like the boogeyman or the devil. The truck engine growled, and it peeled after me while I was in reverse. I didn't have time to turn around, or else it would cut me off and crash into me. Eventually, I reached a clearing where I could turn around by putting all my weight into turning the steering wheel. I zoomed down the forgotten stretches of road with the truck in hot pursuit. My radio came to life with a piercing roar of static. It played an audio that still haunts me to this day. A woman was screaming in pure fear, a deep, primal howl of pure dread. In the background of her screams was that old "Here Comes the Boogeyman" song. A masculine voice could also be heard mumbling, as there was a slicing sound and the woman's screams somehow got louder. I peered into the rear view again to see another horrible thing. 2 huge, pale arms that were 6 feet long coming out from beneath the black truck. The hands balled into fists and tried to slam on my rear window, but I quickly swerved, almost hitting a tree. These pale arms coming from the truck galloped along the ground, helping it gain speed. I soared out of the old roads and pulled onto a modern street and slammed the brakes at a gas station. As I caught my breath and refueled from that horrifying experience, I noticed my radio was spewing a choppy static that sounded like a dying moan. Yeah, I haven't been out driving for a while after. I'm thinking I'm going to start taking a different route. If you do find yourself there, remember to chuck some meat in the field. Look out for... Welcome to Kickin' Chicken. Can I interest you in the number 5 on this fine evening? Repeat that phrase to yourself once. Now repeat it again, on average, 80 times in 8 hours. Such was my shitty, stifling, robotic life. I started my shift, out here in the sticks, at 11 p.m. each night. It ended at 7. The hours alone were tough to manage. After a few months, the stress of rough hours, unruly college kids, and minimum wage work caused pure anxiety that seeped into my days off. My classwork was bombing, my bills were stacked, and for some reason, I still refused to quit that shitty job in Hackensack. The reason was actually pretty clear. Its name was Arabella, and I was intoxicated. My first shift on the job, we brushed up against each other accidentally behind the serving counter. Her leather jacket, tossed ironically over her kickin' uniform, felt smooth alongside my skin. Her jet black hair shined and smelled like cinnamon mixed with strawberry at the same time. The overwhelming dose of perfume commingled with the shampoo to create a heavenly smell laced with a tiny bit of alcohol. I was 18, after all. It took only one shy smile over a 6-hour shift for that girl to become my primary objective in life. I checked the schedule incessantly to see if we were working together, but for the first few weeks after our original run-in, we were on different shifts. Then, finally, to my luck and surprise, one winter evening the tables finally turned. That night was a blizzard. I arrived early to find Arabella operating the store on her own. Apparently, my normal companions had called out sick, and our boss had asked her to work a double shift. I didn't have a lot of questions. Honestly, I was too excited at the prospect of my shameless flirting through the morning. But nothing happened. Arabella manned the fryer while I took orders. The hours crept by as we watched snow stack up in layers of white outside the sliding glass window. Our manager had hired a plow to maintain the drive-through, but even still, not many folks had the courage to come through. After 2, there were only a few cars on the highway at all. I awkwardly used the time to run my best lines past Arabella. "Where do you go to school? Do you live nearby? Did you grow up here?" She nodded and mumbled a couple half-hearted replies. Every 5 minutes, she would run out into the snow with her phone, leaving me alone. I assumed she was smoking a cigarette, or was just catching some fresh air. Or maybe she was bothered by her creepy co-worker, me, that would not leave her alone. Eventually, I cut off the flirting and got back to work. And yet, around 3:30 a.m., we finally found something odd to bond over. A repeat customer. As soon as I uttered my catchphrase, "Welcome to Kickin' Chicken. Can I interest you in the number 5 this fine evening?" I recognized the voice on the other side. "Yeah, let me get the number 5 with a cup of water. And some ice, please, if you don't mind." Same order, same exact words. His face was not memorable, but that voice had just pulled through an hour ago. A cup of ice is an odd enough request to remember. Whatever. I ignored any suspicion and rang him up. The last thing you are supposed to do at a fast food joint is question the size of somebody's dinner. "You got it, sir. Total will be $8.33 next window." "Is the ice free?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I replied, aware that I was repeating myself. I turned to Arabella, who was staring at me with an inquisitive look. Her green eyes grew wide as I mouthed, "Same guy." I punched the order into the machine. Suddenly, she was super talkative. "What do you think he wants?" "What does he look like?" "Good thing we have some left." I mumbled my own replies. I was surprised that she seemed so worried. So what if it was the same guy? Maybe he was just hungry. Maybe he was out plowing the roads. Who cared? After scrambling somewhere in the back corner of the kitchen, Arabella fired up the fryer and started to cook the man's meal. I walked to the window and assured the man in the SUV that it would take a couple minutes to cook. His appearance was truly unremarkable. He had brown hair, brown eyes, glasses, and light skin. The baseball cap on his head suggested he was a Mets fan, and the stickers on his bumper said he had kids. I asked about both casually. The conversation was common and cordial enough until Arabella arrived at sliding window with his order. "Oh, well, you are the only one back there making this delicious chicken?" the man asked flirtatiously. I felt my face flush a violently angry red. She smiled and nodded shyly. He chuckled his reply. "Well, don't go anywhere. I might be back for more of your cookin', cutie." We all laughed and waved awkwardly as he took his food and drove off the ramp. For the next half hour, The man sat in his car in front of the store and enjoyed his meal. I thought nothing of it. Arabella was a lot more worried. "Don't you wish he would just leave us alone?" she said in a mouse-like tone as she drifted over and curled under my sweatshirt worriedly. I welcomed the contact. The smell of shampoo was replaced by menthol cigarettes and something else. "Do you think he will come back?" she asked in a whisper. Then she giggled. "Let's lock him out." Arabella strode over to the entrance and locked the doors as if it were closing time. She also turned off the drive-through light. Then she strode towards me with crystal green eyes lighting up the dine-in lobby. She shimmied a bit and let the leather jacket fall from her shoulders to the uncleaned tile floor. For half a minute, I forgot where I was. Right up until Arabella stuck a 4-inch knife into my gut. "Dolores was a little dry," she said as she stabbed me again. "But I'm so glad to have a fan. Let's get it right this time." She aimed the blade at my leg, probably hoping to nick an artery. This will make a much bigger mess, but hey, he's got to have his meat. The blood loss made me woozy. I was aware of the glass shattering. I can remember the ricochet of bullets. But the most unforgettable thing was the look on her face when she took several of the bullets in the side and died. Arabella was still smiling. A shadow in a Mets hat carried my body out into the snow. Unbeknownst to me, our manager had disappeared that afternoon after an argument with an employee. Her wife had called several times looking for her. But the calm, confident voice at our restaurant, Arabella, told the woman that our boss had not even bothered to show up that day. She knew that was a lie. After a few hours, an officer was sent to investigate, but the man thought he'd order some food first. He was shocked by what he found. Arabella had cut Dolores into pieces in her large white van outside. She then popped those portions into the fryer, mixed them with the chicken, and handed them off to me as part of the number 5. In total, we served 7 different customers human remains. The officer never ate any, but he needed more evidence. So he ordered it on ice. Kickin' Chicken closed indefinitely after the incident. The entire store was investigated. I was never charged with a crime, mostly because I cooperated with investigators every time they asked. I avoid fast food now, even if there is nothing else open on my street. This is the reason. You never know what is in your meat. I was driving home late Monday night, coming from a friend's house. It was well past midnight, and although it was a beautiful, clear night with a full moon to light up the road, I still hated driving this late. "At lest I have to road to myself," I said out loud. I'd driven the road hundreds of times to and from college, but I still got that eerie feeling whenever I was this late. I live in West Virginia, and the road is full of twists and turns, over cliffs and through forested areas. During the day, it was a beautiful drive, but at night, it was a nightmare. Anyway, I was about halfway back to my house when suddenly my car cuts off. Luckily, there was a small mom and pop store close by, and I was able to drift off the road and into its parking lot. I put it in park and let it sit for a minute or two. My car does this sometimes, and most of the time it kicks back to life after a quick rest. However, tonight it did not. I pulled out my cell phone and flipped it open, but it didn't light up. Dead battery. I sat in my car and silently cussed to myself. It was at least a couple of miles to the next house, and I wasn't sure if I would be greeted with understanding or the barrel of a gun in my face when I knocked. Still, I got out and started walking. I hadn't taken 5 steps away from my car when I saw it. Lights. A car up ahead. Yes, I thought, as I quickly ran to the side of the road and tried to flag them down. I watched as the car passed me by, my heart sinking as the lights faded behind me. I was just about to start walking when I heard it. First, the horn blasting, followed by tires screeching. This lasted for a few seconds, then silence just long enough for me to comprehend the sounds before the thunderous crash of metal twisting and glass shattering. I ran over to my trunk and grabbed a small emergency kit I keep. I took out the flashlight and ran to where I heard the sound. I shone the light all over the side of the road, which ended over the side of a cliff into woods 30 feet below. I looked for what seemed like hours, but I couldn't see anything. No lights from the car below, no tire tracks leading off the road. I couldn't even see any gravel move to suggest any living creature was anywhere other than me. I decided to try my phone again and call 911. I turned back to my car when I heard him. Someone was crying out below for help. His voice was weak, and I could tell he was in pain. I shone the light back below, but again could still see nothing. I heard him call out again, and I replied. "Hold on, I'm calling 911. Help's on the way," I yelled, and quickly ran back to my car. I picked up my phone, silently praying that it would work. This time, as I flipped it open, I was blinded by the bright screen. I quickly dialed 911 and explained, through heavy breathing, what had happened, then waited. It took them a little over 10 minutes to get there, and all the while I could faintly hear the man calling back out from over the cliff. I yelled back that I had called help, and it's coming a few times. Suddenly, I couldn't hear him anymore. I turned to go back, to try to keep him going when I saw the flashing lights emerging from the woods. The police and paramedics searched the area for an hour before calling it off. There was no sign of the man calling back, no sign of the car that had gone over the cliff, no sign of any other car but mine, and the emergency vehicular, of course. I explained everything that had happened to the cops, but they didn't believe me. I was threatened with being arrested for the prank, but one of the cops said it wasn't worth it and got the others to leave. I spoke with him a while longer and asked why he had not pressed charges. He sighed and started telling me the story. About a year ago, there was a car accident right where we were. However, no one was around to call for help. Apparently, both passengers, a husband and wife, survived the crash but were badly injured. The husband tried to get help and even crawled back up onto the road before he succumbed to his injuries. The next morning, a car saw his body and pulled over to call 911, but sadly it was too late for both of them. The officer apparently had been called out before, with similar circumstances, and again found nothing. He told me to go home and try to get some rest, and that he would make sure I didn't get in trouble for the call. I thanked him and got back into my car. This time, the engine fired up as soon as I turned the key, and I quickly backed out and made my way home. But as I drove away, I again heard the man's, "I don't drive at night anymore. At least, I don't drive anywhere that isn't very well illuminated." I know that sounds silly, trust me when I say that my friends tease me to no end about it. They're the types that love going for late-night cruises out around the outskirts of town, and to go stargazing, both activities that I enjoyed too once. That was until that one night. After that, I couldn't bring myself out of the light ever again. It was about a year ago, in late July. I was living in a small town at the time in northern Alberta, staying there to get the most out of the cheap community college and low rent. I had just finished my finals and was looking forward to visiting family out west for my week-long vacation. It wasn't exactly a short trip, a total of 4 hours at least, just to even get to the next town over. To get to where my parents were was an additional 6 hours of travel. Driving through Alberta isn't exactly exciting either. Not unless you enjoy wide open spaces and a lot of empty fields at least. It was about 4 a.m. when I got into my car. The bright idea to leave early that I had had the previous night was now leaving me bleary-eyed and full of regret. I headed over to the closest gas station and stocked up on the usual road trip supplies. Energy drinks, chips, pretty much anything that looked good at the time. The coffee I had brought with me was starting to kick in, and I began to look forward to at least the initial first few hours of the trip. That was typically how it was with long car rides for me. The first few hours were great and relaxing, with the rest of the trip just slowly getting worse as I got those fun cramps or stiffness in the body from sitting for so long. Before heading out of the city, I checked my phone, queuing up my playlist of music that would be keeping me company and double-checking my route out of the city on Google Maps. Damn. A red bar sat halfway between me and where I was heading. Construction ahead. Expected delay, 45 minutes. Great. That was just my luck that the main road itself was getting work done, but there wasn't anything I could really do about that. Finally, pulling out of the gas station, I headed out, starting my long journey. The music pulsed through the speakers as the light pollution of the city slowly faded behind me, and the night sky grew ever brighter. It was a full moon out tonight, and one that complemented a sea of stars quite nicely, too. That helped raise my mood up a bit, and I soon got lost in thought as I cruised down that dark road. After about an hour of driving down the open highway, the sky seemed to quickly darken, the moon becoming obscured and the illuminated plains around me fading away to an inky black. The only thing that was visible now outside of my headlights were different twinkling lights off on the horizon and the city lights far behind, still in my rearview mirror. The lights ahead pulsed between orange and reds with the occasional flash of a vehicle's headlights. That had to have been construction, I figured. It was another joy of driving out in these flat areas. You were able to see practically a full hour ahead of you in advance, and just really take in all excitement. At night, without the moon's glow, it was a much different feeling than boring, though. It kind of felt like you were driving through space itself, a massive black expanse all around you, with only the different bits of light off in the distance showing any real signs of life. Almost as though the night sky itself had dripped down and enveloped the ground below. I cursed and shielded my eyes as someone passed me with a set of far too bright to be legal headlights, night vision being lost immediately. By the time I could actually see again, thankfully having not flown off the road, everything that wasn't in my headlights was just pitch black now. The edges of my car's headlight beams didn't seem to extend very far out either. Because of this, I almost missed a pair of cars that were off the side of the road, hazard lights going on and off to try and warn me in advance. I slowed my vehicle to try and get a better look, in case they needed any help, but as I passed by, I didn't see anyone in the vehicles themselves. Neither car appeared to be damaged either. Weird. Maybe the owners had car problems and had hitched a ride back to town until a tow truck could come and retrieve the vehicles. I couldn't really give much better of a guess than that, so I continued on, not wanting to rubberneck any more than I already had. The darkness, at this point, had become rather oppressive. I noticed that outside of my beams of light it was now just a solid black wall, like it just cut off immediately with no glow or anything. I had to slow my speed to half just to be safe. While trying my best to stay on the road, I must have completely forgotten about the construction zone, for when an orange pylon appeared out of the darkness, I hit the brakes. I must have missed the warning signs due to this weird blackout, but this had to have been the start of the construction zone. With due diligence, I crawled through the area, trying to catch sight of any workers or really any signs of life. That was when I realized that there should have been some kind of life around here. I had already seen their lights on further back down the road, but now as I drove through, there wasn't a single piece of equipment that seemed to be turned on in any way. Excavators sat abandoned, doors wide open without an operator inside. Any floodlights had been knocked over or otherwise turned off in some other manner. However, things quickly went south from there. About halfway through was when I saw someone finally. A prone body lay face down on the side of the road, only half of the person visible from my car. I stopped the vehicle, wondering what he was doing at first as it looked like he had his ear to the ground. Eventually, I realized that he must have been unconscious, so I put the car in park, turning on my phone's flashlight and the car interior light before getting out to add as much extra light as I could to the area. The moment I stepped out of the car, I could feel a very stark difference in the air. It was supposed to be the middle of the summer, yet I could almost see my breath. It was freezing out here for some reason. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" I called out nervously, voice holding an odd echo to it that had no right to be there. I shined my flashlight over him as I got closer before quickly stumbling back. Jesus Christ! I practically sprinted back to my car, throwing myself inside and slamming the door behind me. Panicking to find the lock button, my fingers hit it, and I tried to stop myself from hyperventilating. The lower half of that man's body had been eaten. Past his stomach was nothing more than bits of gore and viscera that had been strewn out across the road. It looked like something had just ripped into him and left the rest to rot. I pulled out my phone and tried to call 911, but I had no bars. I must have been too far out to get any signal. It wasn't like I could do anything to help the poor man from here, so I pulled the car out of park and continued out of the construction site. I spotted a few more bodies in varying condition as I tried to make my way out. That was when I saw it. Just as I turned a corner, my headlights illuminated something that was hunched over another construction worker. It almost looked like a person, but it was far too dark. It was incredibly thin, spine jutting out from its back as it initially faced away. When it turned in response to the light, it covered its malformed face with a massive hand that ended in sharp, ragged claws, pinprick white eyes glaring at me from the shadows of its hand as it let out a shriek and bounded off into the darkness. At that point, I slammed my foot down on the gas and floored it out of there, having to swerve once or twice to avoid the abandoned equipment. Eventually, I rocketed out of the site going far too fast, but unable to slow down. In my rearview mirror, I could see them, a collection of white eyes that trailed along behind me in the distance. They didn't make any sound, but I could tell they were getting closer, little by little. I must have had at least some luck tonight, as when I made my way over the next hill, I could see off in the distance a gas station that was still lit up, a beacon of light in this sea of darkness that surrounded me. I managed to get to it in only a few minutes, my tires screeching across the pavement as I came to a halt directly under the gas area. The darkness was like a wall all around it, but I had a clear path to get inside of the building. Taking a deep breath, I escaped my vehicle and sprinted up to the glass door. When I got to it, the attendant inside was already unlocking it and pressing a button on the side to power it on, letting it open enough to get me in before he closed it again with the lock in place. "Are you all right?" he asked me as I stumbled away from the door, trying to put distance between me and the numerous windows that covered the front wall of the station. I felt vulnerable there in that little store, the panes of glass being the only thing between us and all that darkness outside just waiting for the lights to go out. I started to try and explain to him what I had seen, when outside the bulbs began to blow one by one around the top of the gas station, with the darkness encroaching closer and closer until it was pressed up against the windows. The light that was inside didn't seem to faze it at all now. Almost as soon as it had reached the glass, I could see them again, small sets of white eyes dipping in and out of the darkness. "What the folk is going on?" the attendant cried in a panic as he too backed away from the glass. That was when we saw the first crack appear on the window, the tip of a clawed hand pressing into the glass as it singed underneath the bits of light that reached. "I don't know, just help me barricade this," I shouted back to him before shoving the shelves towards the front of the store. The glass held long enough for us to get a sort of half-wall set up, but I knew it wouldn't hold them back forever. Turning to him, I asked, "Is there a security room or somewhere else we can go to hide in here?" He nodded, saying, "In the back room. It's small, but should fit us both. We got into the security room and shut the door, sliding the heavy lock into place before settling in. The room was small, but well illuminated. A row of 6 TV screens showing different camera angles from around the building. 4 of them were completely blacked out, with only 2 left that were inside the store itself. One was positioned in the main lobby, and the second was pointed just outside our door. Only a few minutes after we had entered the security room did the front windows shatter. We only got to see a couple of seconds, but we watched the shelves get pushed aside and the inside go completely black. Now, all of the cameras were dark, and when the single bulb above us started to flicker, I turned on my phone's flashlight just in case. Luckily, the power didn't go out in this room at least, the door being sealed along the bottom as well, so there wasn't any cracks for whatever this thing was to filter in through. We sat there in silence for a time, neither of us brave enough to break it in fear of attracting unwanted attention. That silence broke at the first sound of scratching, which eventually led to a chorus of low whispers just outside of our door. They sounded just like normal people, and if it wasn't for what I'd already seen, I might have thought their pleas for us to come out, I could get that sense of danger just on the edges of it. Like if we didn't comply, there would be consequences. I don't know how long we were forced to sit there and listen to the scratching and whispers. The TV monitors would come on, though, one by one as the darkness seemed to recede, the sky a pool of red and orange that signaled sunrise. We waited until the sun was well above the horizon before opening the door slowly and taking our first steps outside. The store was trashed, glass everywhere along with what looked like hundreds of footprints that had trampled across the merchandise. My car appeared untouched, and I got it running again after the police arrived to aid the attendant. I still don't know what I saw that night. I don't think I ever will. But I think that's for the best, as there are some things that should probably stay in their darkness. I'm on mobile, still shaken by this, which happened last night. I'm not going to entirely disclose the location, but I'll give a general area. This is for more than just my safety, it's for yours too. I'm not that old, still in my teens. 17, to be exact. I'm easily frightened and terrified of many things. Well, specifically storms in this case. There's another story as to why, not fitting for here. I had a 2.5-hour drive home, taking mostly back roads of highways in eastern North Carolina. As a teen, driving alone at night is usually nice and appeasing to me. Tonight, that was not the case. I left around 10:30 p.m. and my ETA was to be home after midnight. This was my first mistake, leaving too late. Secondly, I didn't realize the weather was going to be so bad. I checked beforehand and it was crystal clear, nothing unusual. As soon as I set out on the roads, that had changed. They sky-set black as soon as I left my location, and the lightning was non-stop from every direction. I didn't think too much of this situation, as the weather changes here without warning very frequently. But something was odd. With this heavy cloud coverage and sky-to-ground lightning like this, it was odd to not hear thunder or see any rain. I was already uneasy from the stormy weather, just eager to get home. Cool AC and loud music kept me company as I continued. This weather continued well past the halfway point for my trip, and I finally got the dreadful feeling that something wasn't quite right. Every now and then I'd see a car behind me, mostly on roads without turnoffs, and their lights would just vanish. It seemed off, but I figured I had missed a road somewhere. This happened relatively frequently. I'm headed down a familiar road. I click my Garmin GPS off and proceed my way home. Now, I know this road very well, and I know there isn't anywhere for you to turn off on a 16-mile strip. Maybe 3 miles into this strip, I see headlights come up behind me. Now, lightning is still going furiously and keeping my anxiety spiked. I figured maybe this was a state trooper on patrol for the night, nothing unusual, but the car seemed older the closer it got. The light shape didn't match anything I had seen before. It was kind of strange. My eyes bounced between my mirrors and the roads in front of me. Here's where I first figured it was something big. I glanced back once more to check the headlights, maybe another 3 to 4 miles into this road, and the car is gone. Completely. Next thing I know, I look back forward, definitely confused, and I see a large dog-like shape in the road. My first instinct was to hit my brakes, which of course I did. My car jumped, and the shape jumped towards me. It was about to collide into my windshield when I let off my brake, so not to lose control, knowing there was no stopping it. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, and to my surprise, nothing happened. I stopped my car and shone my lights into the field in the direction that thing jumped, and nothing was there. By this point, I was starting to break down a bit. The lightning continued, the sky still blacker than I had ever seen it. I didn't see any more cars, nor animal-like creatures for a while. Towards the end of this long, inescapable strip of road, something caught my eye. This one wasn't an animal or a car. It was a person. The only thing I could think while slowing my car a tad was simply, why the hell would there be a person alone in the middle of nowhere this late at night? It makes no sense, still to me. Then, to my shrieking demise, a bright crack of lightning shot down beside where this thing was standing, giving it a ghostly light, making me scream like the little girl I am. I caught a glimpse of that shadow of a person before it vanished beyond my headlights. Maybe I was just tired, but I've never had something like this happen. Maybe it was just a bear who nearly got struck by lightning. I had no idea. My heart was racing and I just wanted my bed. I kept going down this road hoping to find the stop sign that led to a major highway where there was sure to be traffic. I believe in ghosts. I always have. But this whole car scenario has happened twice. On this same strip of road, at the same time of night. There's no way it can be a coincidence. My car seemed to shake even, mocking my nerves. The road stretched on longer than I thought. It seemed like a solid 15 miles until I reached that stop sign. I feel like I'm crazy for believing this or thinking that you will, but maybe you will drive down that road one night and you'll understand too. I have a friend who traveled that same route one night to meet me across the way. They described such similar experiences and asked me if it was something I had noticed. If anyone has any ideas, I would love to hear them to avoid this conundrum. I have no choice but to take this way at night sometimes, and it's the only road to get me across the way to my home without going 30 miles out of the way. I haven't slept since then. I can't look outside my window at night, for the fear of that storm cloud to return. When I got home, the sky seemed to instantly clear, revealing the moon, both times. Does anyone know what this could be? If anything happens again next trip, I'll update you guys. I'm just worried that it's getting longer every trip. To all those out there who live in areas near wide stretches of empty land like I do, I'm sure you've already been warned why it's dangerous to travel rural roads at night. Growing up in Seattle, one of the biggest cities on the West Coast, I never really needed to worry about the dangers of driving through the middle of nowhere until I committed to a college in eastern Washington. To those who have never been here, the eastern side of Washington is so different from the western side that some may think they accidentally took a wrong turn into another state. Primarily used as farmland, eastern Washington is almost completely absent of all the elements that give the other side its famous reputation as the Pacific Northwest: plentiful forests, constant rain, bodies of water. Instead, this side is mostly just rolling fields of wheat and dried grass that stretch into the distance with a few tumbleweeds and windmills here and there. Driving through this area when the sun's still up can actually be quite pleasant on a nice day. The big sky above, and nothing but miles and miles of golden hills on each side of you. Unfortunately, driving through eastern Washington at night is actually one of the most nerve-wracking experiences I will ever have, and here's why. If you've ever had to drive a country road at night, I'm sure you've already been lectured by everybody and their mothers on the obvious dangers like drunk drivers, falling asleep at the wheel, and animals suddenly running across the road. In my particular area, we have a lot of issues with head-on collisions due to antsy students passing cars recklessly in an effort to get home faster. In addition to these more sensible hazards to be aware of, there's also the famed superstitions like the ghost, murderous hitchhikers that wait on the side of the road at odd hours of the night, begging for a ride. To top it off, probably the most dangerous part of traveling these rural roads to keep in mind after sundown is the fact that there is no cell service throughout a massive part of the area. So, basically, if anything happens to you out here, you're folked because you'll have no way of contacting anybody for help. There's no civilization around for who knows how many miles, and the chances of another car coming by anytime soon is pretty slim. With these dangers in mind, it's safe to say that the story I have for you is about an occurrence that I hope never needs to be warned of again. Now, let me begin by saying the creepiest thing about driving through these empty farmlands at night is by far the lack of light. With no need for any streetlights in the middle of nowhere and no towns or cities anywhere nearby for the majority of the trip, the only light besides those your headlights provide is that of the stars and moon above. It's a surreal experience looking out your window and seeing only darkness beyond the railing on the side of the road, mostly because you have no idea of what could be out there. And that's precisely why you should be the most scared of driving country roads at night. One day, my boyfriend and I were driving home from my cabin in eastern Washington when I noticed a car pulled over on the side of the road. When we passed the car, I noticed it was completely empty and wondered where the people inside could have gone, considering there was nothing even remotely in walking distance from where we were. I figured they had run out of gas and hitched a ride to the nearest town, but my theory of where they had gone prompted my boyfriend to tell me a story that I will never forget. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Washington State had a bit of a cult problem. This wasn't the first I was hearing of this, considering the fact that one of the church camps I went to when I was younger was, oddly enough, built on the grounds of a disbanded satanic cult. LOL, who made that decision. Anyways, most of these cults resided over on the east side because of how far away it was from literally everything and everybody, and they wanted to isolate themselves. These cults could basically do whatever they wanted and fly completely under the radar due to the fact that there was nobody around to stop them because a lot of the time nobody even knew they were out there. And that's why they were able to get away with what they did. One summer morning, a police station in one of the few tiny towns amongst the farmland received a call reporting a missing person. The caller claimed their husband had not returned from his shift at the paper mill the night before, and she was worried he had gotten into an accident because he hadn't answered her phone calls. Many of the residents in these small towns commuted to jobs way out in the country land because many of them were either farmers or workers at the local paper mill, so accidents at night were not uncommon. The station agreed to send out a patrol car to look for him along his route to the mill. At one point along the road, the officer noticed that one of the speed limit signs had disappeared, and noted that it may have been the cause of the missing person's presumed accident. Local kids must have been bored, but what else did they have to do out here? The man's car was found pulled off to the side of the road about halfway through his commute without a single scratch on it. He was nowhere to be found, but his car was unlocked and his wallet and cell phone lay in plain view on the passenger seat. Something definitely did not seem right. After weeks of investigation, the man was still missing, and nobody had any idea where he had gone. For several days, the police station anxiously awaited any news that could solve the mystery behind the disappearance of the man. But because of the usually uneventful nature of the area, the only report called in was that of another missing speed limit sign. Stupid kids. A few days later, the phone rang once more. There was another missing persons report almost identical to the one before. Somebody hadn't returned home from their shift the night before. The police sent out a patrol car once again, and sure enough, there it was. An untouched, abandoned car on the side of the road with the missing person's belongings clearly left behind. But this time, there was something different. Faint scratch marks could be seen on the driver's seat that trailed onto the floor and out the door. Had somebody been dragged out of their car? This realization of possible assault or abduction raised great alarm, and the announcement was made to all local residents to lock their doors on their commutes home at night and be extremely cautious of anybody who may try and approach their car. One night, around 2 a.m., the station received a call that would answer their disturbing question of where these people disappeared to. A couple had been traveling the road where the people had gone missing that night and had just narrowly escaped the fate of those before them. They had fortunately heard the announcement a week before and made sure their doors were locked and kept an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. Apparently, a few minutes after they had entered an area void of any cell service, they noticed a single ray of light that appeared to be floating directly in the middle of the road just a ways down the route. Confused as to what this could be, the couple slowed down cautiously. As they neared the source of the light, they saw something that probably gives them nightmares to this day. Standing in the middle of the road was a chain of people, linked together arm in arm, creating a barrier in the street. The man in the middle held a flashlight in his teeth. The car came to a complete halt. There was no way to go forward. Then, in what seemed like a split second after they had stopped the car out of the complete and utter darkness on each side of the road, two people leaped over the railing and ran towards the car and tried to rip the doors open. The human chain had been a distraction. Thankfully, the doors were locked this time, and the husband frantically switched into reverse and slammed on the gas pedal. They got away and had immediately called the station once they regained service. When the police asked if they'd seen where they'd gone, as they drove away, they simply answered with "back into the darkness beyond the road." An investigation occurred, but the people in the road were never found. To this day, nobody knows who these people were or where they came from. They eventually did find the bodies of the missing people, though. Both victims were found bound to what looked like the stolen speed limit posts and severely burned. What could be the reasoning behind ripping people from their cars at odd hours of the night and burning them alive out in the middle of nowhere? Without explanation, the police chalked it up to cult activity. But how could it be possible that there was no trace of these people anywhere? It is almost as if they vanished into thin air. What's almost more disturbing is the fact that for all we know, they could still be out there. We just don't know. All I can tell you is to think twice next time you're driving a country road at night and mindlessly staring into that deep darkness just beyond the railing. You never know who could be staring back. The glow of the dashboard, the faint passing of streetlights, the soothing hum of your car, the road that draws you further into the darkness. Even with your high beams, the inky blackness dominates your vision. Many people dread driving at night. Everything seems different. Everything seems dangerous. But I love it. I love the rush of anxiety when I panic, thinking I miss the exit I've taken hundreds of times. I love feeling alone and isolated. I love seeing trees that were once shrouded in shadows to be illuminated. Driving at night brings a pleasure nothing else can provide. It brings comfort. Many people hate driving at night because it awakens a primal fear of sort. Was that someone hanging from a tree, or was it my imagination? Were those glowing orbs the eyes of some nocturnal beast, or was that a ghost? You convince yourself that if you stop for the briefest of moments, something evil will snatch you from your car. Shadows can easily make someone go from confident to paranoid within a matter of minutes. Nerves are shot, your hands turn white as you clutch the steering wheel, your eyes focused on the road that seems endless in the darkness. Unknown hurdles far into the distance you can't see until it's too late. It's a shame so many people dislike it. They miss out on all the wonderful things that happen at night, like when you pass another person driving alone at night. For the briefest of moments, you can't help but feel a spiritual connection with the unseen driver. Kindred spirits, one could say. It gives you the peculiar feeling of, I'm not alone in this. Or like the alien feeling of seeing familiar sights look slightly different. It almost feels magical, looking with round eyes at the different scenery, making you feel like you had driven into another world. One that's like ours, but it has subtle differences that gnaws away at your consciousness. But what's even better is all the bizarre things you happen to see out of the corner of your eyes. The stuff that stays with you until you arrive at your destination. The scary events that really hits you later and leaves you shivering in fear. One night, I had been driving home from work. It was a long day, so I was feeling incredibly tired. Tired enough I had to pull onto the shoulder and take a moment to compose myself. I didn't want to run the risk of falling asleep at the wheel. I took the opportunity to text my roommate and let her know I was going to be late. The road was next to a large stretch of land that once grew crops, and beyond that field was a forest. I had driven past it thousands of times, but this was the first time I stopped on the side of the road, both at night and during the day. I had just placed my hand on the shift lever to continue my journey when something hit the passenger window, making me scream. I whipped my head to the window to see who it was, and standing outside was a man. Immediately, I tensed. Being a woman, alone at night, with no one else around, put me on edge. I eyed the man suspiciously. He seemed harmless, but looks can be deceiving. Rolling my window down just a crack, I asked, "Can I help you, sir?" "My car broke down," the man explained. "I was wondering if you could give me a ride to the nearest gas station." Did he think I was dumb or what? I hadn't seen any car on the side of the road, and even if there had been a car, this was 2020, he should have a phone. "Why don't you call for someone to pick you up?" I asked, starting to feel uncomfortable. "Call? Oh, you mean a cell phone?" he said. "No, I don't have one." At least he hadn't made the excuse his phone was dead. "I'm sorry, but I'm not comfortable with letting a stranger into my car," I said, "but I can call for someone to pick you up." I reached for my phone, looking down at the console to pick it up. "Do you have someone to—" I looked up, my voice trailing off when I realized he was no longer there. Frantically, I whipped my head around, wondering if he walked around the car to get to my side. However, I didn't see him. Did he duck out of sight, I thought. Becoming anxious he was doing something to my car, I went into drive and sped off, hoping I had seen the last of him. Spoiler alert, I did not. A few minutes after the encounter, I noticed my gas tank was almost empty. It didn't make any sense. I had just refilled the gas 2 hours ago. When did it get so low? Thankfully, in a mile, there was a gas station. I had stopped there many times, but never at night. One of my acquaintances worked the night shift there, and I wondered if she would be in there. Maybe I could go inside and get a small cup of coffee, see if she was there or not. I pulled into the gas station and felt some relief upon seeing a few cars there. 2 cars at the pumps and 1 car pulled up to the gas station. I could see 2 people, a man and a woman, lingering outside the store, both stretching and rolling their shoulders. I pulled next to a pump, cut off my engine, yanked the key out of the ignition, and turned to grab my purse. "Thanks for the ride, miss," a familiar voice said behind me. I froze and slowly turned to see the man sitting in the back seat. He was unbuckling his seatbelt, acting as if I had given him a ride, rather than him somehow sneaking into my car. Not my proudest moment, but I screamed like a little girl and scrambled out of the car. The man and woman looked startled when I ran up to them. "There's a person in my car!" I screamed, frantically waving my hands. "I don't know how he got there! Oh my God, oh my God!" The man ran over to the car as the woman placed her hand on my arm to calm down. "I don't know how he got in there," the words tumbled out of my mouth. "My doors were locked when he stopped me. Are you sure someone was in there?" the man asked, rejoining us. "I looked in and around the car, but there's no sign of anyone there." He looked worried, probably thinking I was insane. "Yes!" I screamed. Also, not my best moment. "I saw him! He thanked me for the ride!" The man and woman exchanged glances, and the woman guided me into the gas station. A young man stood at the register, his eyebrows drawn together. He had heard my screaming but didn't want to abandon his post. A woman stood idle in front of the counter, a bag of chips in her hands. "Everything all right?" the attendant asked. "There was a man in my car," I blurted out, "but he's gone." "Did you stop on the side of the road?" the attendant asked. When I nodded, he continued, "Did the man knock on your window?" When I nodded again, the attendant went back to work, scanning the woman's chips. "He can't hurt you much, being as how he's dead and all that." "What?" the four of us in the store asked. "Yeppers. Ages ago, some guy's car broke down and he had to walk to a gas station to call for help. Apparently, it was incredibly dark out and he was hit by a car. Fella doesn't know he's dead, so he'll ask people who stopped if they could give him a ride. I'd say it's bullshit, pardon my French, but with the number of people who come in here talking about their mysterious passenger makes me believe otherwise." "You didn't offer him a ride?" Chip Bag Lady asked, clearly delighted in the ghost sighting. "In most cases, people do. Maybe he couldn't take no for an answer and get into your car." "That doesn't help, B," the other woman said, disapproval in her voice. B shrugged her shoulders. "He should be gone now," the attendant added. "He thanks the drivers and disappears. For a ghost, he's very polite. Hope he passes to the other side or whatever someday." True to the attendant's words, I didn't see any sign of the ghost when I pulled out of the gas station. However, when starting my car, I immediately noticed how the gauge showed my car still had plenty of gas to get me home. It wasn't until I was driving back home the next night did I really accept what had happened. I was passing by the area I had encountered the ghost when a shiver ran up and down my spine. A smile grew on my face as I glanced out the window, hoping to see a ghostly figure wandering by the side of the road. It was the type of smile that said, "Bring it on, ghost. I'm not scared of you." In the heat of the moment, it's scary, but later, it sends a delicious chill down your spine, leaving you with a ghostly story to think about next time you drive alone at night. And this was just one of many bizarre and eerie incidents that happened to me over the years. I definitely know I'm not the only person with scary stories of nighttime driving. I eagerly look forwards to more disturbing incidents while driving at night. I love to adventure. Being to almost all 50 states, I've seen my fair share of diversity within nature and people. My main reason for travel is to explore the wilderness. Sometimes I will backpack the Rocky Mountains, which I have some fucking messed up stories about as well. Drive through national parks, and then drive through the desert. Growing up on the East Coast, I didn't get to experience the desert much, so I tend to favor a desert drive over a mountainous drive. I've been doing this for a couple years now, and haven't experienced anything too odd in the desert other than the sheer feeling of aloneness when out there. My favorite time to drive the desert is at night, though, because the stars illuminate the desert floor. About a month ago, however, I saw more than just sand and stars on this particular desert drive. I was driving through the desert in Arizona. Nightfall was closing in on me, which was one of the best times. The sunset across the desert brought me to a whole new place. Sometimes I would even camp out in my car, because in a sense, I loved how alone I was out there. Normally, I'd bring my dog with me, but my parents were in town and they decided to watch over him. So I was all alone this time. Again, with night fast approaching, I didn't know whether to camp out or keep driving home. I figured my parents would want to see me, and I was only about an hour from the house, so I continued the trek on through the quickly darkening desert. If any of you have been through the desert in Arizona, you'd know that you occasionally see horses along the side of the road. So seeing figures on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere wasn't anything out of the ordinary. With only 45 minutes to get home, my high beams picked up on a different figure on the side of the road. It looked like a person. Being the overly generous person I am, I pulled over by the person to see what was wrong. As I approached, I noticed the person wasn't moving, though. They were just sitting upright. He didn't seem to notice that I was even there. His head never turned. "Are you okay?" I asked. No answer. In fact, no acknowledgement that I had said anything. The man was poorly dressed, rather pale, but surprisingly clean-shaven. He was oddly skinny, though, and the more I focused on him, the more I realized how abnormally skinny he was. "I was driving by and noticed you. I just wanted to make sure you were okay," I told him. Still nothing. He was staring straight at the ground. I stood there awkwardly for a couple seconds until I finally saw his jaw move. "I need some water," he let out. His voice was deep. It didn't sound like a person, though. I can't quite explain it, but his voice just sounded off. "Okay, man. Let me grab you some out of my car," I told him. I started walking away, as my car was about 10 or 15 feet in front of him. I walked to the passenger door and reached for my bottle of water. Before I could reach it, though, I just sensed something was off. I jolted my head around to where the man was sitting, but he was gone. I was panicking now, but for no real reason. He obviously wasn't of a threat, but I didn't know where the folk he went. I closed the passenger door and took a quick look around. I heard a movement from behind a rock about 10 to 20 feet off the road. A man emerged from behind the rock, but it wasn't the same man. This guy looked crazed, and he was holding something in his hand. He started running towards me. I jumped into my car and flowered it down the road. As I looked back in my rearview mirror, I realized there were more of them. Maybe 5 or 6, all emerging from behind rocks right off the road. They were all staring at me as I sped off. I had no intention of slowing down. In fact, I would be happy if I got pulled over by a cop. I would have felt so much safer. Within about 3 or 4 minutes of that happening, I felt relaxed enough to play some music. I took one last glance in my rearview mirror. I shivered. I was in complete shock when I saw the man I had offered water to sitting in my back seat just staring at me. His eyes, oh my God, his eyes. They weren't looking at me, they were looking into me. I was of course slamming on the brakes at this point. Still in too much shock to make any noise, I couldn't take my eyes off him. He started to smile, just like that man back there did. It was crazed. He had a look of death in his face. "You're gonna be one of us soon?" he started as he lifted up a knife. I jolted out of the car, and I could hear the back door opening up. This guy was fast, unhumanly fast. I couldn't outrun him for long. "Are you ready?" the deep voice shouted as he quickly approached me. It was dark out now, too. I had no clue where to go. It was over, or so I thought. Headlights were approaching us both. I was a couple 100 feet from my car now, but I didn't hear the man behind me anymore. The car was fast approaching me, and I tired signaling it down. Thank the Lord it saw me and stopped. After explaining to the man driving it what happened, he tried phoning the police. Sadly, he had no signal. His name was Mark, and he agreed to follow me home just in case anything else happened. He also had a pistol on him, which really made me feel safe. After about 35 minutes of driving with Mark behind me the whole way, I finally made it back home. After thanking him, I went to go check the back seat of the car to see if all my stuff was still there, or if he had left anything. Luckily, everything of mine was still there. I did, however, notice a sheet of paper on top of my backpack. I opened it up. "You aren't safe. You will be one of us soon," the note read. A chill ran through my body. I had a footstep in front of my car and jolted up. "The dog threw up," my mom said, standing right in front of my car. I went back inside but didn't say anything to my parents. They're not people who would believe any of that crap. I figured I would call the police and let them know what happened after they left. "Oh yeah, and some guy stopped by looking for you about 20 minutes ago," my mom started. "Who?" I asked. "I'm not sure. He didn't give a name. He was a rather skinny guy, deep voice, didn't talk much. He gave me a letter to give to you. I didn't open it because, well, why open someone else's mail? It was weird. Something didn't seem right about him, but I figured you know a lot of people. So here's the letter." She handed me an enclosed envelope. My heart was racing again. As soon as my parents left, I opened the note. "We know where you live," the note read. My heart sank. After calling the cops and explaining everything, they investigated it for a little while. Sadly, they found no sign of people along the section of road I was on. I gave them the letter for DNA reasons, but still haven't heard anything back. I installed a security system into my house and haven't had any problems since. Growing up, I knew that something was off about my childhood town. For one, there was a list of unwritten, but mutually understood, rules that we had to observe. These rules, in all honesty, were pretty much just cultural taboos passed down from the older generation. Things like not leaving the rice bucket empty, as it is a sign of being poor, and avoid shaking one's legs when sitting down, as it symbolizes shaking off good fortune, to name a few. Some of the rules were definitely a little on the creepy side, though, like never hanging out clothes to dry overnight, because dirty stuff may be attracted to them. But there was one particular rule that had always struck me as odd, I guess. The rule was simple and straightforward. No one is allowed to travel on the road after sundown. It didn't specify which road, but everyone generally took it to mean the twisting, narrow 2-lane road that led down the hill to the nearest city 30 miles away. It was the only connection between the town and the city, so during the day it would often become congested. The more experienced drivers, my father being one of them, would rush to the city and back in the final hours before sunset when the road was less crowded. But no matter what, once night fell, no one drove on the road. Not even my father, who'd rather sleep uncomfortably in his car overnight than to attempt the return trip home. One time, I asked him about the rule out of curiosity. He remained strangely quiet for a while before saying, "There are no streetlights along the entire stretch of road, so it is dangerous to drive at night." I could tell from his eyes that he was hiding something else, so I tried pushing the question a little further. "Papa, why don't you just drive with the headlights on?" But my father simply shook his head. "It's too dangerous even with the headlights, Hui. When you become older and learn how to drive, you'll know why the road is so dangerous." I did grow older, but I never bothered learning how to drive, since my older brother already had a driver's license and inherited our family car. Unlike the rest of us, however, he never really cared about the rules since young, and much less the stupid driving ban, as he called it. My father caught him sneaking out of the house to drive late at night on more than one occasion, and it only got worse when he started dating a girl from the city. At some point, he just gave up and told my brother, in the sternest tone I'd ever heard from my father, not to call home if he gets into any sort of trouble. My brother, of course, was over the moon. He loved to brag about how wonderful and freeing it was to speed along an empty road without a care in the world, and even persuaded me to go together with him a few times. I refused each time, though it would be a lie to say that I wasn't envious of him. But soon, my father's warning became a bizarre reality that I'm sure none of us would ever forget. It all started when my brother told us that he was going to bring his girlfriend over to our house after she had knocked off work at 7 p.m. My father didn't say anything, but my mother uncharacteristically voiced out her concern. "Son, it's best to let her visit during the day." "Don't worry, Ma, she'll be staying overnight in my room," he said with a nonchalant wave of his hand. "Can is can, but not today." "She won't be free till next weekend, Ma. It's all right, La." It was too obvious what my brother had in mind. I could only admire his tenacity as he hopped into our Toyota and screeched off into the vanishing sunset. Nothing seemed amiss at first, though my father and mother had a small argument in their bedroom that I couldn't catch before going to sleep early. Meanwhile, I was lying awake on my bed, secretly waiting for the sound of my brother's car to return so that I could sneak a glance at his mysterious girlfriend. "There's no way someone with his looks can land a pretty girl," was probably the thought running in my head when my ears caught the unmistakable ring of the telephone. Well, to be exact, my next-door neighbor's phone was the one ringing. Not many people could afford a landline back then, especially outside the major cities. My family hence borrowed my neighbor Ismail's phone whenever we needed to make or receive calls. Soon after the shrill ring stopped, Ismail knocked on our door loudly, calling for my father. But despite him being a light sleeper, I couldn't hear the sound of my father getting out of bed to answer the door. I understood then that this was his way of teaching my brother a lesson. Ismail seemingly caught on to it too, because the knocks soon ceased and I heard him walking away from the door. I hesitated, wondering if it was really okay to leave my brother to his own devices in God knows where, before poking my head out of my bedroom window, which faced the road outside. "Abang, was it from Kuan?" "Oh, you're awake," Ismail exclaimed, though there was a grim look in his eyes. "Yes. His car has broken down somewhere below the hill. I'm going down to see if I can help him out. Are you coming along?" I agreed without a second thought and got into the front passenger seat of his silver Cancel. Once we passed the last row of houses, it was as if the entire world had melted away. All I could see out of the windows was a thick, impenetrable fog of inky black. Ismail seemed unfazed, however. "Abang, you haven't turned on the headlights," I said, panicking when I realized he was driving almost blindly at 60 km/h and increasing. "No good," he replied calmly in Malayu. "The noise is already disturbing enough. The lights will anger them." I didn't dare to ask who exactly were we angering. We raced down the hill for what felt like an eternity in complete darkness, cornering so sharply at each twist and turn that the tiny hatchback seemed to skid on two wheels. It was only until we spotted two flashing amber lights in the distance that Ismail finally put his foot on the brake. "That's our car!" I pointed at the Toyota parked by the roadside with its hazard lights on. "Yes, I see it," Ismail muttered. "But I don't see anyone in the driver's seat." "Huh?" But sure enough, when we neared the stranded Toyota, my brother was nowhere to be found. Instead, a girl sat in the front passenger seat, visibly shaken but otherwise unhurt. She didn't seem to react to our presence when Ismail stopped beside the car and rolled down his window. "You all right?" he shouted. When she didn't make a move, he pressed the horn until she finally turned her head towards us. I couldn't quite tell her facial expression because of how dark it was, but an inexplicable shudder ran down my spine when I felt her gaze on me. "Are you here to help?" She spoke in a bare whisper. "Where's Guan?" Ismail asked back, his voice becoming sharper all of a sudden. "Where did he go?" Her hand slowly gestured towards the pitch-black road ahead of us. Ismail paused for a moment before turning towards me. "You stay here with the girl. I'll go find Quan on foot myself." Wait, Abang?" By the time I fumbled with my seatbelt and finally unbuckled it, he was long gone. The only saving grace was that he had left the key in the ignition, so I had the engine idling noise and the meager light from the dashboard to accompany me in the dark. Well, there was also the girl, but something about her felt extremely... "Hui, can you see them? There, behind your car." Her whispery voice startled me. I was about to question how in the world did she know my name, but curiosity got the better of me, and I turned my head around to glance at the rear window. At first, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to see, but then the hazard lights from my brother's car flashed, and for a split second I caught something stretching across the width of the road. What the hell was that? The hazard lights flashed again, and I could now make out the something to be shadowy wisps floating in a single row. My scream froze in my throat as the lights flashed once more, revealing 6 distinct humanoid figures standing shoulder to shoulder. And with every flash, the figures came closer and closer, their ghostly appearances becoming clearer and more defined. I was snapped out of my fright by a loud rap on the window. "Hui, hurry up and unlock the car door!" I blinked, and the figures vanished as though they were never there to begin with. Somehow I managed to find the knob to release the door lock in the dark, and Ismail tossed my brother's limp body into the back seat with a grunt. I let out a gasp. Is he okay?" "He'll live, but they played a pretty bad prank on your brother," he said, settling into the driver's seat and starting the engine. "No choice but to leave your car here, so tell your parents to meet me in the morning. I can drive them down here to get the car back." "Okay." I hesitated before gathering the courage to ask, "Who are you talking about, Abang?" "Ah, right. You haven't been born yet when it happened," he said quietly. "Long time ago, this road formed part of a highway that went all the way to the capital. A lot of vehicles from the north used this road to get there, and because of the many sharp turns, it was easy to lose control if you weren't paying attention. Many accidents happened here as a result. One night, a long-distance bus was traveling on this exact road with 7 passengers, all high school students on a holiday trip to the capital. The driver was new to the road, and while overtaking another vehicle, he noticed that there was a bend ahead too late and couldn't stop the bus in time. He pointed at the road ahead absent-mindedly. So he jumped out through the driver's door, and the bus with the 7 passengers crashed right down into a ravine. The ravine was too steep and deep to attempt a rescue, so in the end, everyone on the bus was presumed dead. The bus was never recovered, however, and to this day it's rumored that their bodies are still lying somewhere down there, waiting to be found. That's horrible. I couldn't help but shudder. So, just now those figures must have been... "You saw them?" Ismail mumbled. "How many did you see?" How many?" I said in surprise. 6, I think." Something clicked in my mind then, and I started. "Wait, one's missing!" "No," he whispered, as he stared at the rearview mirror. "The girl." I frantically turned to check on my brother in the back seat, but a hand shot out and stopped my head in place. "Hui, no," Ismail said in a low voice. "Don't look." That was the first time I've ever seen true fear in someone else's eyes. Forcing my saliva down my suddenly dry throat, I sunk into my seat and lowered my gaze to the best of my ability. Ismail turned the car around and began the journey back. Yet this time, we were struggling to gain momentum uphill even in first gear. It felt like the car had become several times heavier than on our way down, and I was more than certain my scrawny and underweight brother wasn't the cause of it. "Abang, what should we do?" I muttered so softly that I thought he wouldn't catch what I was saying. "They won't hurt us," he answered, though his voice was strained. Then he began murmuring something under his breath, some sort of prayer chant, if I were to guess. The car suddenly jerked from side to side at that very moment, as if something heavy was thrashing about in the back seat. It took every fiber in my being not to scream out loud in panic. I swore I heard laughter from behind before the shaking abruptly stopped. Ismail didn't waste another moment and slammed the pedal to the metal, sending the cancel flying up the road at breakneck speed. If not for his driving experience, I wouldn't doubt for a second that we would have long ended up in a ravine, too. It was only when the lights of the town appeared in the distance that we finally slowed down, and when Ismail pulled up next to our house, my father was already waiting by the front door. The two men exchanged a knowing look, and after thanking Ismail for his help, my father effortlessly hoisted my brother out of the car and into our living room. It wouldn't be until the next day when my brother finally regained consciousness. Bizarrely, the last thing he remembered was the engine mysteriously dying on the way back home and him exiting the car to open up the hood. He couldn't recall ever calling Ismail to ask for help, and I soon realized there was no way for him to make a call in the first place, since there were no payphones along the road. As for his girlfriend, apparently she had fallen ill and was forced to stay at home, so he didn't manage to meet up with her at all that night. Oddly enough, however, my brother has avoided driving on that particular road since then. It wasn't until recently, when a new highway to the city that completely bypasses the old road was completed, that he suggested going on a night drive together out of the blue. I was so surprised that I agreed without a second thought. It wasn't until I sat down in the front passenger seat that I suddenly remembered the incident from many years ago, and it occurred to me just how strange my brother's change of heart was. "So, what's up?" I asked him curiously. "What makes you want to drive at night again after so long?" "Oh, I never stopped wanting to go on night drives," he said nonchalantly. "It's just that, for the longest time, I keep on having the same nightmare about the old road, and it seriously makes me hate driving on that road to my very core." I laughed. "A nightmare?" "Yeah, it's honestly super weird," he muttered. "It's always the same bus going down the same stretch of road, and I always find myself in the driver's seat no matter what I do." My smile faded. After overtaking a car in front, I must jump out to save myself or else I'll die in a deep ravine. Man, the screams at the end are the worst, I swear. They never fail to wake me up in cold sweat. My husband has been away on a business trip up north for the last few days. I work as a wedding caterer, so I often have to work late and in some pretty remote places. The other night I finished working a venue around 11:30 p.m. My colleague took the van back to our warehouse. I had drove myself to the venue, which was an old barn in the middle of the countryside. As I left the venue, I was hoping other guests were coming my way, but unfortunately not. I only lived 30 minutes away, but my journey home took me through single-track roads surrounded by farmland. As I turned off the main road onto the rural track, I hastily turned my lights to full beam. Around 10 minutes in, the road began to narrow. The branches of sidelining trees brushed against my car. I was only going around 20 mph as I cautiously made my way through. I was conscious that a car could come towards me at any moment. Suddenly, something emerged from a bush up ahead. My apprehension caused me to jump as I hit the brakes. A small deer walked across the road and disappeared into the parallel trees. I laughed, getting scared of a deer, I thought, mainly to compose myself. I never liked the dark as it was. A noise then echoed behind me like someone had tapped their fingernails down my back windscreen in a wave-like motion. I slowly peered into my rearview mirror, expecting to see a horror straight out of a Stephen King novel. My eyes were only met by darkness. I locked the car doors to try to ease my fear. I put the car in drive and pressed my foot down firmly on the accelerator. My tires span as I weaved through the winding trail. All I wanted to do was to get home. I turned the corner as my headlights exposed a looming figure in front of me. I slammed the brakes, but it was too late. They went under. I felt every bump, my stomach sinking with each and every one. I came to a stop, thoughts racing through my mind. I'm going to jail was my first thought, then quickly to the fact I had just killed someone. I was in shock. I couldn't bring myself to look back. Smoke filled the air around me. I forced myself to turn my head eventually. The mangled body lay on the cold, dusty road. I didn't even have time to compose myself when, to my horror, their head twisted to face me. Their arms followed, twisting and planting down in front of them. The loose, ripped shirt hung around its torso. The startling thing was this person didn't have a face, no hair, no eyes, no nose or mouth. These features were replaced by thick ridged scars as they glowed in my bright red taillights. I froze. I couldn't process what was happening. This wasn't normal. This was no man or woman. I panicked, and the adrenaline kicked in. I shifted into reverse and stamped on the pedal. The engine roared as I launched backwards. There was a crash off my rear bumper, followed by the jaggering bumps under my right side wheels. I quickly shifted into drive and sped down the road. As I drove off, I peered back into my mirror, the road behind me being swallowed by darkness. I couldn't see any of the hallowing scene that I had left behind. I continued up the road with my hands gripping the steering wheel, looking in my rearview mirror every couple of seconds. I had 3 miles to go until I got to a main road, and I slowly increased my speed to escape the horrific incident. I came to the main road and continued home. I leapt out of the car and fumbled my keys to try to unlock my front door. My heart was still racing from the terrifying experience. I opened the door, rushed through, and locked it straight away. I pressed my back against it and sighed in relief. I tried calling my husband, but now being past midnight, he didn't answer. I turned the TV on and tried to calm myself down. After 20 minutes, I was finally able to breathe normally and was getting tired. I went to get a glass of water from the kitchen. I stopped, rooted to the spot. It was in the window. The now bloodied head pressed up against the glass behind my sink, not moving. I shakily got out my phone and called the police. They were here within minutes. As I went through what I had saw to the officers, I could see the disbelief in their faces. I was hoping the blood on the window would prove it, but it was gone. They left me 45 minutes later. I was still a nervous wreck, but by this point I just wanted to go to bed. I made sure everything was locked and headed upstairs. After a broken night's sleep, I woke the next morning. To my surprise, my husband was home and laying next to me. I was still half asleep as I rolled over to hug him. Maybe the police had checked in with him to come home, and I had slept through his phone calls. He startled and turned. My eyes began to adjust. This wasn't my husband. The deep, blood-stained ridges were now inches from my face. I screamed out of pure horror. I grabbed the nearest thing to me, a glass, and smashed it over its disfigured head. I escaped through the door and ran out of the house while grabbing my bag. I got in the car and sped off down the road. My fuel was getting low. I knew I wasn't going to get far enough away, so went straight to the train station. I jumped on the first train to near where my husband is working. I have spoken to him, and I am doing okay. As I sit here writing this post, I still can't process what's happened to me the last 12 hours, and I'm still pretty shaken. I just don't know what to do. When I get to my husband, we will figure something out. All I know for sure is I am not going back to that house, not alone. My main fear now is it has got attached to me. I have trouble going to sleep at night. I won't whine and complain about having false insomnia. I just can't go to sleep at night. Some say I have an anxiety problem. Others say I just need to take pills. But I've never gone to a doctor about it. Instead, I just get in my truck and drive around for about an hour at night to relax and unwind. Usually it works, and while expensive, I sleep well through the night with no problems. I live in Lubbock, Texas. For those of you who know the area, you know that once you leave Lubbock, it's several miles in either direction before you reach another town. The highways leading out of Lubbock go through miles of flat nothingness before reaching another town, and even then the towns are so small you could throw a stone across the town and it'd be out before it hits the ground. Driving on Highway 84, it's a long way from Lubbock to Littlefield, the nearest large town to the city. It's a nice drive to make when you're alone. Very calm, quiet, and dark. The kind of drive that almost puts you to sleep behind the wheel. On this particular night, it was a typical, cold, late January night. I had recently started up classes at Texas Tech again and was feeling a bit stressed. So I do what I always do around midnight when I can't sleep. I grab my keys, throw on a coat, grab a small cup of warm coffee, and drive. I took Highway 84 that night as I hadn't driven the road since I'd come back from winter break. As I passed shallow water that began the long stretch of open road between shallow water and Anton. I was no more than a fourth of the way to Anton when I heard a tap on my passenger window. I figured it was a rock and ignored it. But then I heard it again, and again, and again. 3 distinct taps on my passenger window like someone was trying to get my attention. I turned my head to look out the window. To this day, I wish I hadn't. Staring back at me, with dark black irises, was a man. His face pale, almost gray, sitting in the dead center of the window, smiling. That smile was the most evil thing I have ever seen. He bore all of his teeth in a wide smile. They were pearly white, and not one of them was out of place. His hair was jet black and short, almost like something out of the 1950s. But that smile, the never-ending grin he bore, has been etched into my mind permanently. I jumped and jerked my truck slightly into the other lane before recovering and straightening out again. I had taken my eye off the window, hoping what I had seen was just a hallucination of some kind. I looked back, and he was still there, just smiling at me like he had been waiting to see me. He raised his hand and started waving at me. I turned my head forward and stared straight ahead. I jerked my truck into the left lane and then swung it back into the right. But I didn't look to see if he was gone. I was too afraid to look. I kept telling myself to keep my eyes on the road and find a place to turn around. Then I see something out of the corner of my eye. I glance over, and it's a man, running on all fours, naked. My jaw dropped. I looked at my speedometer. 75. I look back. It's him, smiling at me again. I floored it and race away from the guy. I heard him jump into the back of my truck. I check my rearview mirror, and there he is, staring back at me through the mirror, still smiling. I'm almost in tears. I just want him to go away. I find a turnaround, slam on the brakes, and check my rear view. He never moved. It was like he had no momentum at all. I didn't even look to make the turn. I just did it and hit the gas as soon as I was on the road again. I can't even be bothered to do the speed limit. As far as I'm concerned, this was an emergency. I returned to Lubbock without the thing in my truck. I know this because as I turned onto my street, he was standing on my front porch, waving to me. I hadn't seen my father in years. It had been 2 decades since I had set eyes on the man. My last clear memory of him was the one of him walking out the door when I was 5 years old. I had been watching cartoons. I turned just in time to see my dad's back as he walked out the door, wearing his standard blue jean jacket, with his head down as the door slammed behind him. My mother was on the floor, sitting cross-legged and crying a few feet away from me. The sight shocked me. My mom never cried. She was my rock, and I had never seen even as much as a tear from her. I crawled over to her and sat in her lap while she sobbed, completely at a loss of what to do. I remember I stroked her hair to comfort her, something she had done countless times for me when I was sick or upset. "Where's Dad going?" I asked innocently. My mom looked at her, her eyes red and puffy from the crying. "Your daddy is gone, sweetie. Your daddy left us," she mumbled. The divorce had to be done in absentia. No one knew where he had gone. I remember walking around town with my grandmother putting up missing posters of my father. She could never accept that he had simply walked away from all of us. The posters stayed up for a few months before they all got torn down. Years passed. Mom remarried a great guy. I got therapy to deal with my dad leaving and eventually went off to college. Life was normal, though I never stopped thinking about my dad, not really. Even when I thought I came to terms with it, I'd get the urge to Google his name or search for him on social media, but nothing ever turned up. That's why, when he finally did message me, it came as a complete surprise. I was at work, messing around on my phone while I had reports to write when it popped up on my screen. "Is this David Lewis from Topeka, and your mom's name is Penelope? If so, then this is your father. I have been trying to get in contact with you." I sat and stared at the message in disbelief. I set the phone down, then picked it up again and read the message. While I was processing everything, more messages appeared. "David, I'm so sorry for everything. For these years I stayed away. I really need you to answer me. I need you to agree to come meet with me." My first instinct wasn't to reply. I was half convinced this was some kind of scam. Someone knew about my past and they were going to ask for a Venmo or money transfer. I finally replied, "How do I know this is really my father and not some kind of scam?" I waited for a reply. My heart was pounding, and a rush of thoughts were going through my head. If this was really my dad, I had a lot of things to say to him. Most of them weren't good. I promise you, I'm your dad. When you were a kid, you had a ginger cat named Polka that died when you were 3. You had a stuffed teddy bear you slept with every night whose name was Mr. Simon. Please, David, this is really me, and I need you to agree to meet with me. I stared at my phone. I was racking my brain trying to think of what to say. Tell him off? Tell him I'd gladly meet him because I had missed him all these years? I did neither. I need some time to process this. Let me write you back later this evening. I'm at work and I need to focus. Holding the phone, I waited for his reply. It came quickly. I understand. But please, I need an answer by tonight. Going back to my desk to work on the reports was almost surreal. It was like I was a ghost in my own body. I did get everything done, though. It gave me something to focus on. Once I was home, I went straight to the bedroom and flopped on the bed, phone in hand. My fiancée wasn't home yet. Today was her late day at work. Of all the people I wanted to talk to the most, it was her, but she wouldn't be able to answer even if I did call. I read over the messages again. Honestly, I didn't have to reply at all. I could block him, let him sit around and wonder what he did wrong to make me abandon him. But I did finally message back. The curiosity was too much. "Why do you even want to meet with me? If there's anything you want to say to me, just type it out." His reply was almost immediate. "David, I'm so glad you wrote back. I was afraid I had lost you. Trust me, I need to see you in person. If you never want to see or speak to me after that, I promise I'll never reach out to you again." I lay the phone down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. This was just too surreal to me. The front door opened and Alicia walked in. "I'm home," she called out. She walked into the bedroom when she couldn't find me in the living room. She looked down at me and furrowed her brow. "Are you okay? Did something happen?" she asked, concerned. I shook my head and held up my phone. My dad just messaged me. He wants to meet me tonight to talk in person. I don't know if I should agree to go or not," I explained, holding out the phone to her so she could read what he wrote for herself. Her eyes went wide. Of all the things I could have told her, this didn't seem to be one that she expected. She took the phone and read over the messages. "What do you want to do, babe? I know he's your dad, but he's essentially a stranger. You don't owe him anything. You still don't have to meet with him," Alicia assured me, holding my hand. I want to meet him, even if it's just to find out why he left. I want to hear it from him," I said, squeezing her hand back. I turned back to the phone and typed out the message. "Where do you want to meet?" "Send me the address." His response: "Thank you so much, David. This means everything to me. I'm sending the address now." I was only mildly surprised when the address he sent me was only 30 minutes from our apartment. I looked it up on Google Maps and it showed a tiny cabin out in the woods. I felt a stab of anger from knowing he was this close to me and was only now reaching out to me. How long had he lived there? Years? Months? I would find out soon enough. Alicia insisted on coming with me, but I convinced her to stay at home. She had the address where I would be, and if she didn't hear from me in 2 hours, she would call me. And if she didn't hear from me, she'd call the cops. She wasn't convinced yet that this wasn't some elaborate scam. I had plenty of time to think on the drive out to my dad's place. When I arrived, I felt a pang of anger at the house. It was a lovely little log cabin. I knew enough about the area to know it wasn't cheap, and I wondered what he had been doing all this time to afford such a nice place. Not paying child support, that was for sure. The car had barely come to halt before the door opened, and a man opened the door and awkwardly walked up to the driver window. "David," the man said, breathless, a small smile on my face. It was my dad. Now that he was here in the flesh, it didn't feel real at all. He looked haggard and thinner than his photo had let on. I stepped out of the car and he backed away to let me out, the small smile still on his face. Everything I had planned to say to him vanished from my head as he gestured towards the house. "Come on, let's get you inside. I have a lot to explain before it's time." He started moving to the cabin, not looking back to see if I was following. I followed. I started at the back of his head, glaring. He hadn't tried to hug me or touch me in any way, for which I was glad. But I was also disappointed that he hadn't tried. The inside was nice. Minimally, but tastefully decorated. It had a woman's touch, as Alicia would like to say. Maybe he had a girlfriend or even a wife. "Mom remarried. His name is Steve. He's a great guy," I blurted out. My dad turned and looked at me. The smile fell from his face and his eyes dropped. "I know. I saw that on social media. She looks happy," he said softly. I shrugged. I had said that to hurt him, but now all it did was make me feel a little guilty. "Why did you ask me to come here after all this time? I just want you to know, if you are going to ask about getting a kidney or money from me, you can forget it." I snapped, my voice sharper than I had intended. I wanted to play it cool, collected, but I was too frazzled. He stared at me. His eyes were watery, as if he was fighting back tears. He seemed at a loss for words. I shifted awkwardly on the couch, averting my eyes. "I just needed to see you. I wanted to explain why I left. I'm not going to ask for forgiveness, but I do want you to understand why I did what I did," he said in a rush. I looked up at him. The obvious answer was that there had been another woman. Or maybe some kind of debt to the mafia. Anything, really. But now that I was about to learn the reason, all I felt was a slow, simmering anger. No matter what excuse he gave me, it wouldn't be good enough. "I'm a werewolf," he said simply, spreading his arms in a gesture of resignation. I had to admit that all the things I had thought he might say, this was not one of them. "I see," I said slowly. He was mentally ill. Maybe he was schizophrenic or had some kind of mental break. "Look, if you brought me all the way out here so you could spin some kind of fairy tale about why you left, save it. I can tell you're doing well for yourself. There's no need to lie to me." I gestured angrily around the cabin. His eyes followed my hands as I pointed to our surroundings, and a tiny smile formed on his lips. "Oh, this isn't my house, David. The people who live here are on vacation and I broke in, but we needed a quiet place to talk," he explained, stepping closer. I stood up and sidestepped away, moving closer to the door. "Are you serious? Do you have any idea how much trouble you'd be in if you're caught? You go to jail for stuff like that," I stammered. This wasn't going how I thought it would at all. I was wishing it was a scammer. It would have been less heartbreaking. He moved towards me. He lifted his shirt, and that's when I saw he had a gun holster on his belt with a small pistol housed in it. In a smooth motion, he lifted out the gun and held it out to me. "I need you to do one thing for me. In all these years I've been away, I've done nothing but try to find a cure for this. To end it, to cure it, it doesn't matter. All I could find was this. The only thing that can truly stop me is silver. I have this thing loaded with silver bullets. It had to be done by someone who loves the afflicted. Otherwise, it won't work. Trust me, I've tried the alternatives." His eyes were dripping tears as he thrust the revolver into my hands. I stared at it dumbfounded. "Dad, this is insane. You're insane. You need to go to a hospital." I stared in shock at the gun. I'd never held one before. "It must be done by someone who loves me. My parents are dead. I know your mom doesn't love me. It must be you. You're all I have." He gulped as he spoke. I held out the gun to him, but he stepped away and walked towards the door, blocking the exit. "Look, we don't have much time. Once night falls, this will happen quickly, and you should know I don't have control over myself when the change comes. I've killed people without even remembering it. You won't be any different even if you are my son." He gulped again, the color draining from his face. I took a step back from him on reflex, clutching the gun to my chest protectively. I didn't want to give it up anymore. I didn't believe for a second that he was a werewolf, but giving him the gun seemed like a bad idea. "It's time to go outside now. No reason to ruin this nice house," he huffed. His breath was coming faster, like he had just run a mile. His face, already pale, was taking on an alarmingly waxy texture that was making my stomach turn. I had no idea if he was having a stoke, but he suddenly did not look good. He stumbled outside and I followed him, not knowing what to do. I glanced at my car. I could just run to it and leave, take the gun with me and call an ambulance for him. "Don't even think of trying to make it to the car. You won't have time anyway." He looked up as the last rays of daylight vanished over the horizon. "It's happening. Forgive me, David. Please know I always loved you. I hope you still love me," he rasped as he doubled over, seemingly in pain. "Dad," I gasped, taking a few stops towards him. "No!" he screeched at me, holding his hands out and backing away before he fell to the ground and started convulsing. It happened instantaneously. In the movies I'd watched about werewolves, the transformation is always drawn out, painful, and dramatic. But this wasn't it. His skin split open like it wasn't even skin anymore. It parted like his flesh was made of papier-mâché. My vision blurred as I took everything in. The beast rising from the sheds of skin and clothing and looking at me. Its eyes were a vicious amber, glowing and filled with pure malevolence. There was nothing human in them. We stared at each other for just a few seconds before it took a leap towards me, closing the distance between us in a split second. I shrieked and brought up my arm, the one with the gun. The creature was close enough for me to touch. I could smell the wet animal smell of its fur as it reached out towards me. I fired the gun on instinct. I fired twice, one bullet hitting the thing in its cheek, and the second in the chest where the heart should be. The beast let out an almost dainty and human-sounding gasp as it collapsed sideways. It looked surprised as it hit the dirt. I dropped the gun, my fingers numb from shock, and I ran to my car. I started the car and peeled out of the driveway. The headlights briefly illuminated the thing's body as I drove away. It hadn't moved. The shock hit me as I was driving, and I struggled to keep myself on the road. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that thing chasing me down. But there was only darkness behind me. I didn't call the cops or an ambulance. I cried silently the whole way home. There was nothing I could tell anyone that would make any sense to anyone. Alicia had waited up for me, and when I burst in the front door, she gasped and asked me what had happened. I couldn't tell her the truth. I made up a lie on the spot, that I had met my dad, and he was a drug addict asking for money. That the cabin wasn't even his, but a place he had broken into. I had to talk her out of calling the cops. There was no way I could ever explain why there was a dead lycanthrope in the driveway. She stayed up with me until exhaustion finally took her and she passed out on the couch. I stayed awake, though. There was no way I could sleep. I sat in the dark, sipping coffee and shaking. When the first rays of light peeked through the blinds, I let out a sigh of relief. The sunlight brought sanity with it, and I could start trying to convince myself that I had hallucinated this whole night. That's when my phone buzzed, and I reflexively looked at the message that popped up on my screen, and my heart dropped. It was just a single sentence. David, it didn't work. On our way back to Washington from Oklahoma, Leilani and I stopped in Tennessee. We ran out of gas, my bad, and had to walk to a gas station. It was a 40-minute walk to get there, and another 40 minutes back, so it was pretty dark by the time we were on our way back to the car. We could see the car in the distance when a figure stepped out onto the road in front of us. From the distance it was at, all we could tell was that it was an unusually tall man, wearing an old-fashioned stovepipe hat. Leilani and I were giggling about the idea of running into Abraham Lincoln on the road when we realized how wrong the shadow in front of us was. It was at least 7 feet tall, the arms were too long, and it seemed to be moving in an unnatural way. We stopped, hoping the shadow would stop too, but it continued to approach. There was nowhere for us to go. We didn't think we could outrun whatever it was if we turned back towards the gas station. But we also didn't like the idea of trying to run past it to the car, and we didn't feel safe stepping off the road to get away. Before long, the shadow was right in front of us, a giant, dark figure leaning over us menacingly. It wore a gray, button-down shirt tucked into gray pants, which were, in turn, tucked into brown boots. The most disturbing part was its face. The figure had large eyes and no mouth, and it looked down at us with malice. It swayed back and forth like a tree in the wind, craning its head slowly down to look at us. While its eyes were filled with a strangely malicious energy, it didn't seem aggressive. It reminded me of a person crying in public. The way their face seems to go from grief to anger the longer people just pass them by with no concern for their well-being. Leilani reached over and grabbed my hand and said, "Excuse us." She took a step forward, and the figure raised both arms, holding them out straight. Hanging from each arm were several bodies, each one attached to the arm with a noose around its neck. From the mouth of one body came a man's voice, dark and raspy but somehow almost musical, that said, "You have nowhere to go." Leilani tilted her head stubbornly. "Yes, we do. Back to our car." It's hard to make a lot of expressions without a mouth, but the creature in front of us seemed briefly taken aback by Leilani's decisive answer. It leaned closer, and another corpse opened its mouth to speak, voice rasping in a hypnotizing lilt. "There is no purpose in leaving me behind. I am the inevitable. All make the decision to follow me." I felt a chill shake my spine, and the creature made eye contact with me. In its eyes, I saw tragic life after tragic life, each one ending on this road with this creature. It sighed sadly, and all the heads nodded at me. Another dead mouth opened to speak. "You see the truth in my words. You see that the only release from sorrow is death. There is nothing to fight against when the fight is already lost. You have been losing for so long. Allow me to take your burden away." It felt like a cold spike was being driven through my chest. Every moment I had ever felt like giving up came crashing down on me like a wave. A secret fight I had refused to share with even my closest friends. Staring into the figure's pale eyes, I did feel like I was fighting against the inevitable. I noticed something I hadn't seen previously, an already tied noose dangling from its left hand. It held the noose out to me, and another mouth opened. This time it spoke gently. "Why wait any longer? You can be released now. Released from the fear and shame, the pain and suffering of your life can come to an end." I could vaguely feel Leilani tugging on my hand, but it was like a tunnel was forming around me. All other thoughts were cut off. I could only see and hear what was right in front of me. The mouths all smiled, and the creature held its arms out as if for a hug. "You can join me. We will walk from this place together. You will find eternal companions with us." Then Leilani spoke, shattering the darkness. "I'm so sorry that was your experience, and I'm sorry for all the people who agreed with you." She squeezed my hand. "But there is help. There's no shame in asking for it, and I hope you can find rest. I wish we could help you." She looked at me. "But we can only help each other." The creature let its arms fall to its sides as all the malice left its eyes. It looked at Leilani for a long moment. It vanished, and I burst into tears. Leilani and I stood on the road for a long time, holding each other and talking. We had been planning on finding a hotel, but decided to drive for a while longer so we could talk. Leilani asked questions, and I answered all of them honestly, feeling like we were doing surgery on a part of myself that had been fighting an infection for a long time.